The iceberg cracked open with a blue glow, and inside was a boy who'd been frozen for 100 years. This is the entire Avatar, the Last Airbender timeline from the moment Aang woke up in the Southern Water Tribe to the day Sozin's comet lit the sky and the war finally ended. In this video, we'll walk through every era of the journey. The ice, the temples, the sieges, the disguises, and the final battles that decided the fate of the world. We'll cover Team Avatar's growth from confused kids running from the Fire Nation to the group that stood against the Fire Lord himself. No theory, no speculation, just the canon story of how a 12-year-old airbender and his friends crossed the world, learned to trust each other, and stopped a war that had burned for a century. The sky over the Southern Water Tribe was gray and quiet, the kind of day where the cold felt permanent. Katara and Sokka were out on the ice, not looking for anything in particular, just moving through another day in a village that had been drained by war. Then the iceberg appeared massive, glowing from the inside, sitting in the water like it had been waiting. Katara reached toward it, felt something pull, and the ice shattered. Light burst out, and when it cleared, there was a kid floating inside a sphere of frozen air, eyes closed, perfectly still. Aang woke up confused but not scared, asking questions like he'd just been asleep for a few hours instead of a century. He didn't know the war had happened. He didn't know the Air Nomads were gone. He didn't even know he was the Avatar yet. He was just a kid who wanted to go penguin sledding. Katara saw the arrows on his head and hands, the airbending monk tattoos, and realized what they'd found. Sokka was less excited. To him, this was just another complication in a life that was already hard enough. They brought Aang back to the village, and for a little while, it almost felt normal. He played with the kids, made jokes, acted like the war was something distant. But that peace lasted about as long as it took for a Fire Nation ship to show up on the horizon. Prince Zuko's warship cut through the ice, and the whole village went silent. Zuko stepped off the ship with his crew, scarred face locked in a scowl, and demanded the Avatar. He didn't ask nicely. Aang gave himself up to protect the village, and Zuko dragged him onto the ship. But Katara and Sokka weren't going to let that stand. They snuck aboard, broke Aang out, and the three of them escaped on Appa, a massive sky bison who had been frozen in the iceberg alongside Aang. As they flew away from the burning village and the Fire Nation ship, it became clear this wasn't going to be a short trip. The Avatar was real, the Fire Nation was hunting him, and Katara and Sokka had just joined a chase that was going to stretch across the entire world. Aang still didn't fully understand what being the Avatar meant, but he knew one thing. He wanted to go home. The Southern Air Temple was the only place that made sense to him, so that's where they headed. Sokka didn't trust Aang, yet didn't trust the idea that some kid who'd been sleeping through the war could actually fix anything. Katara believed, though, she'd spent her whole life waiting for the Avatar to return, and now he was here, riding a sky bison and cracking jokes like the weight of the world wasn't on his shoulders yet. On the way south, Zuko and his uncle Iroh followed. Zuko's entire life had been bent around one goal: capture the Avatar, restore his honor, and return home. Iroh tried to slow him down, make him think, but Zuko wasn't interested in wisdom. He was interested in proof that he wasn't a failure. Every time the Avatar slipped away, it made Zuko more desperate, more willing to burn through anything to get what he wanted. That tension between Zuko's obsession and Iroh's patience was already starting to crack. By the time they landed near the first Earth Kingdom town, the group had started to settle into roles. Aang was the one who saw the good in people. Katara was the heart, the one who kept everyone moving when things got hard. Sokka was the planner, the one who didn't trust easily but cared more than he wanted to admit. And somewhere behind them, Zuko kept chasing, kept failing, and kept refusing to stop. The war had been going for 100 years, and now the Avatar was back. That should have felt like hope, but mostly it just felt like the Fire Nation had a new target. The first chapter of this story wasn't about saving the world yet. It was about a kid waking up to find out everything he knew was gone, and two siblings deciding to follow him anyway. It was about a prince who couldn't let go, and an old man trying to teach him that some things weren't worth the cost. And it was about a sky bison carrying them all toward a war none of them were ready for yet. The iceberg had cracked open, and nothing was going to be quiet again. The Southern Air Temple sat on a mountain peak, wrapped in clouds and silence. Aang had been talking about it the whole flight, excited, nostalgic, telling stories about his friends and his mentor Gyatso like they were all waiting for him to get back. Katara and Sokka didn't say much. They'd seen what the Fire Nation did to places. They had a feeling this wasn't going to end the way Aang hoped. When they landed, the temple was empty. Not peaceful. Empty, gutted, empty. The courtyards were cracked, the buildings half collapsed, and there were scorch marks on the stone that had been there for decades. Aang walked through it like he was in a dream, still expecting someone to show up, still calling for Gyatso. Then he found the skeleton. His mentor's body, surrounded by Fire Nation armor, proof that Gyatso had fought and died defending this place 100 years ago. Aang's grief hit fast and hard, and the Avatar state triggered for the first time raw power, no control, just wind and light and rage tearing through the temple. Katara pulled him out of it, talking him down, holding onto him until the glow faded. That moment was the first time Aang really understood. The Air Nomads were gone, all of them. He was the last Airbender, and the world he remembered didn't exist anymore. The guilt that came with that realization, guilt for running away, guilt for being gone when his people needed him, was something he'd carry for the rest of the journey. For now, he just sat there, quiet, trying to process a loss too big to fit inside him. While Aang was dealing with that, Zuko was having his own problems. His ship needed repairs, his crew was exhausted, and Iroh kept suggesting they take a break, maybe rethink the whole chase the Avatar across the world plan. Zuko refused. He couldn't afford to slow down. Every day the Avatar was free was another day. Zuko stayed banished. Another day, his father's disappointment hung over him like a shadow. Iroh tried to reach him, tried to remind him that honor wasn't just about what other people thought of you, but Zuko wasn't ready to hear it yet. He just tightened his grip on the mission and kept moving. The group's next few stops were rough. They hit a small Earth Kingdom village that had been taken over by a Fire Nation commander, and Aang's instinct was to help. Sokka warned him that getting involved would only make things worse, that they didn't have time to fix every broken town they passed. Aang helped anyway. He freed the villagers, embarrassed the Fire Nation soldiers, and moved on before the situation could get worse. It was a small win, but it set a pattern. Aang wasn't going to ignore people who needed help, even when it slowed them down. Another town, another problem. This time it was a group of Earth Kingdom soldiers who'd been imprisoned by the Fire Nation, and Katara pushed for a rescue. Sokka came up with the plan disguises, timing, quick in and out, and it almost worked. Almost. They got caught halfway through, fought their way out, and barely made it back to Appa in one piece. It was messy, chaotic, and proof that they were still learning how to work as a team. But they got people out. That mattered. Between these stops, the Fire Nation kept closing in. Zuko wasn't the only one hunting the Avatar anymore. Word was spreading, and other Fire Nation commanders started taking an interest. Some wanted the glory of the capture. Others just wanted to make sure the Avatar didn't become a problem. Either way, every town the group stopped in became a risk, and every fight made it harder to stay ahead. Katara was learning waterbending on her own, pulling from a scroll she'd managed to get her hands on, practicing whenever they had a moment. She wasn't strong yet, not compared to what she'd need to be, but she was improving. Aang tried to help, but his natural airbending instincts didn't always translate. Sokka, meanwhile, was stuck being the non-bender in a group that was starting to revolve around elemental powers, and you could see the frustration building in him, even if he didn't say it out loud. One of the heavier moments in this stretch came when they encountered a Fire Nation-controlled town where the people had stopped resisting. They'd accepted the occupation, adapted to it, learned to live under Fire Nation rule because fighting back had cost them too much. Aang wanted to inspire them, wanted to remind them who they were, but the reality was harder than that. You can't force people to fight when they've already lost too much. The group left that town quietly, and the weight of it, the idea that some places were too broken to save, quickly stayed with them. Back on Zuko's ship, Iroh kept trying. He told stories, made tea, gently pushed Zuko toward the idea that maybe there was more to life than proving himself to a father who'd already written him off. Zuko listened sometimes, but he always came back to the same thing. Without his honor, he had nothing. Iroh understood that pain, but he also knew the path Zuko was on led nowhere good. The tension between them was building, but for now, Zuko was still the one steering the ship. This chapter wasn't about big victories. It was about Aang learning what the world had become while he was gone, about Katara and Sokka realizing the Avatar wasn't going to fix everything instantly, and about Zuko burning himself out chasing something that kept slipping through his fingers. The Southern Air Temple had shown Aang the cost of the war. The towns that followed showed him the work that was still ahead. And somewhere behind them, Zuko kept chasing, kept failing, and kept refusing to let go. The war had left scars everywhere, and this group was just starting to understand how deep they went. Kyoshi Island felt like a break. It was isolated, untouched by the Fire Nation, and the people there had their own warriors, the Kyoshi warriors, Led by Suki, who wore face paint and fought with fans and moved like they'd been training their whole lives, Aang was immediately drawn to the place, partly because it was peaceful and partly because the statue of Avatar Kyoshi reminded him he wasn't the first person to carry this weight. Sokka was skeptical at first, especially when Suki and her team made it clear they didn't need his help. But after some humbling and some training, Sokka started to respect what they were doing, and something else started between him and Suki, something neither of them had time to figure out yet. Katara spent the time practicing her waterbending and watching Aang get showered with attention from the villagers. It was the first time people had celebrated the Avatar's return, and it felt good for about 5 minutes before it became a problem. Aang let the fame go to his head, showing off, riding the giant koi fish, acting like a hero instead of just being himself. Katara called him out on it, and Aang realized he'd been so focused on feeling good that he'd forgotten why they were there. That moment, Katara reminding him to stay grounded was one of the first times their dynamic clicked into place. She kept him honest, but the peace didn't last. Zuko tracked them to Kyoshi Island, and the fight that followed tore through the village. The Kyoshi warriors held their own for a while, but Zuko's firebending and his crew's firepower were too much. Buildings burned, and the team had to leave fast to stop the damage from getting worse. As they flew away, Aang looked back at the smoke and realized something he'd been avoiding. Wherever he went, the Fire Nation would follow. Helping people also meant putting them in danger, and that guilt was starting to stack up. The next major stop was Omashu, one of the last great Earth Kingdom cities still standing. Aang had been there before, 100 years ago, and he remembered it as a place of wild invention and fun. His old friend Bumi had lived there, and Aang was hoping to find him again, maybe even get some advice. What he didn't expect was that Bumi had become the king of Omashu, ancient, eccentric, and still just as chaotic as Aang remembered. Bumi tested Aang with challenges that felt more like games, trapping Katara and Sokka in crystal and forcing Aang to solve his way out. The tests weren't just about strength, they were about thinking differently, about seeing past the obvious answer. When Aang finally figured it out, Bumi revealed himself and told Aang something important. The Avatar needed a teacher, someone to help him master earthbending when the time came. Bumi wasn't going to be that teacher. Omashu was under threat, and he had a city to protect, but he made it clear that Aang needed to find someone who would teach him to think like an earthbender. Neutral Jing. Waiting, listening, striking at the right moment. Aang didn't fully get it yet, but the seed was planted. Leaving Omashu, the group ran into Jet, a charismatic freedom fighter who seemed like exactly the kind of ally they needed. He was around their age, knew how to fight, and had a whole crew of kids who'd been displaced by the Fire Nation. Jet talked about justice and resistance, and Aang and Katara were drawn to him immediately. Sokka, though, noticed things didn't add up. Jet's methods were extreme, and his hatred of the Fire Nation had bled into hatred of anyone connected to them, even innocent people. The breaking point came when Jet's plan to flood a Fire Nation-occupied town became clear. He didn't care that Earth Kingdom civilians would be caught in the water. To him, anyone who cooperated with the Fire Nation deserved what they got. Katara confronted him, and Aang tried to stop the flood, but the damage was done. The town survived, barely, and the group left Jet behind, shaken by how close they'd come to trusting someone whose anger had twisted into something ugly. It was a hard lesson. Not everyone fighting the Fire Nation was a good person, and revenge could rot you from the inside if you let it. This chapter also marked the first time Katara's belief in people got challenged. She'd wanted to see the good in Jet, wanted to believe he was just hurt and needed help. But Jet had made his choice, and it wasn't one she could fix. That realization that some people were too far gone, or at least too far gone for her to reach hurt more than she expected. Sokka, meanwhile, felt vindicated in his skepticism, but he didn't rub it in. He just reminded Katara that trust had to be earned, not given. Between Kyoshi Island, Omashu, and Jet's forest camp, the group learned a lot about the world outside the Southern Water Tribe. They learned that safety was temporary, that allies could be complicated, and that the Fire Nation's reach went deeper than just soldiers and ships. The war had changed. People turned some into warriors, some into opportunists, and some into bitter, broken versions of themselves. Aang, Katara, and Sokka were still figuring out how to navigate that world, and every stop taught them something new about who to trust and when to walk away. Zuko, during all of this, kept chasing. He hit dead ends, lost the trail, found it again, and burned through his crew's patience in the process. Iroh kept trying to slow him down, to make him see that this path was costing him more than it was giving, but Zuko couldn't hear it. His honor, his father's approval, His place in the Fire Nation, all of it hinged on capturing the Avatar, and he wasn't going to stop until he did. That obsession was starting to crack him, but he didn't care. He just kept moving, kept failing, and kept refusing to let go. By the end of this chapter, the group had survived their first real betrayals and their first real tests of trust. They'd seen what the war did to people, how it turned friends into enemies and safety into traps. They'd also started to understand that being the Avatar's companions meant more than just flying around on a sky bison. It meant making hard choices, questioning the people around you, and accepting that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't clear until it was too late. The road ahead was long, and the Fire Nation wasn't the only danger. Sometimes the danger came from people who looked like they were on your side. The Fire Nation Fortress mission came out of nowhere, a detour that almost got everyone killed. Katara had heard about waterbenders from the southern tribe being held in a Fire Nation prison, and she couldn't let it go. Sokka tried to talk her out of it, but Katara was past listening. This was personal, so they snuck into the fortress, disguised as Fire Nation soldiers, and tried to find the prisoners before anyone noticed. It didn't go smoothly. Inside the prison, they found Haru, an earthbender kid they'd helped earlier, and a handful of other benders who'd been locked up for years. The Fire Nation had taken their hope along with their freedom, and breaking them out meant more than just opening doors. It meant convincing them they could still fight. Katara gave a speech, raw and honest, and it worked. The prisoners rose up, took control of the fortress, and the group escaped in the chaos. It wasn't a clean victory, but it was a victory, and it reminded Katara why she was doing this. People needed the Avatar, but they also needed each other. During that mission, Zuko was also at the fortress, chasing a lead on the Avatar that turned out to be nothing. He ran into the group by accident, fought them briefly, and then had to make a choice: keep chasing or let them go to avoid blowing his cover. He let them go, not because he wanted to, but because getting caught by his own people would have been worse. That moment where Zuko's need for secrecy accidentally helped the Avatar was the first crack in the idea that he was just a straightforward villain. He was trapped by his own circumstances, and sometimes that trap worked in Aang's favor. Around the same time, Zhao entered the picture. Commander Zhao was everything Zuko wasn't: confident, ambitious, politically connected, and ruthless in a way that didn't require anger. He wanted the Avatar too, but not for honor, for career advancement, for power, for the kind of glory that came with delivering a prize to the Fire Lord. When Zhao found out Zuko had been tracking the Avatar, he didn't thank him. He took over the mission, humiliated Zuko in front of his crew, and made it clear that Zuko's exile didn't earn him respect, it earned him contempt. Zuko challenged Zhao to an Agni Kai, a firebending duel to defend his honor, and for a moment, it looked like Zuko might actually win. He had the skill, the focus, the anger, but when Zhao was down, when Zuko had the chance to burn him, Iroh stepped in and reminded Zuko that honor wasn't about beating people when they were defenseless. Zuko walked away, and Zhao got up, humiliated but alive. That decision not to finish Zhao would come back later, but for now, it was just another moment where Zuko's code twisted as it was kept him from becoming the thing his father wanted him to be. Between the prison break and the Zhao situation, the group kept moving. They hit small towns, dealt with minor Fire Nation patrols, and slowly made their way north. One of those stops involved a stolen waterbending scroll that Katara desperately wanted. She stole it from pirates, got caught, and the whole thing spiraled into a mess that almost got them all killed. Aang and Sokka had to bail her out, and Katara had to admit she'd let her desperation for training override her common sense. It was another lesson in trust, but this time the lesson was about trusting herself not to make stupid decisions just because she felt behind. The scroll helped, though. Katara started improving faster, picking up moves Aang couldn't teach her because waterbending and airbending didn't work the same way. She practiced every night, and you could see her confidence growing. Sokka, meanwhile, kept sharpening his strategic mind, planning escapes and ambushes and ways to fight smarter instead of harder. He didn't have bending, but he had creativity, and that was starting to matter more than raw power in a lot of situations. Another stop brought them to a town dealing with a spirit problem, an angry spirit destroying the forest because humans had disrespected it. Aang, as the Avatar, was supposed to be the bridge between the human world and the spirit world, but he had no idea how to actually do that. He tried talking to the spirit, tried calming it down, but nothing worked until he figured out the source of the anger. The town had destroyed a sacred grove, and the spirit wanted it acknowledged. Once the people admitted their mistake and started replanting, the spirit calmed. It was a small moment, But it reminded Aang that being the Avatar wasn't just about fighting, it was about balance, about understanding both sides and finding a way to make them work together. Zhao's pursuit ramped up during this stretch. He wasn't chasing them personally yet, but his influence spread. More soldiers, more ships, more pressure. The Fire Nation's strategy was shifting from one prince looking for the Avatar to the entire military taking this seriously, and that change made everything harder. Towns that might have helped before were too scared now. Paths that used to be safe were being watched. The net was tightening, and the group could feel it. One particularly rough encounter involved a Fire Nation town where the group had to hide in plain sight, pretending to be refugees. It worked for a while, but Aang's natural instinct to help people combined with his terrible poker face blew their cover. They fought their way out, but it was close, and Sokka made it clear that Aang needed to learn when to lay low. Being the Avatar meant people needed you, but it also meant you couldn't save everyone every time, especially when saving one person put the whole mission at risk. By the end of this chapter, Katara had grown stronger as a waterbender, Sokka had proven himself as the team's tactical backbone, and Aang was starting to understand the impossible weight of being the Avatar, how every choice rippled outward, how helping one person could hurt another, and how the Fire Nation wasn't going to stop just because he was 12 and still figuring things out. Zuko, meanwhile, was stuck between Zhao's ambition and his own fading hope, watching his mission get taken away from him piece by piece. And Iroh kept watching, kept hoping, kept trying to steer his nephew towards something better before it was too late. The Fire Nation's pressure was personal now, and the group's margin for error was shrinking fast. Winter was coming, and with it, the solstice, a time when the spiritual world and the physical world were closest. Aang had been seeing signs, strange visions, flashes of a past life, warnings from spirits that something was coming. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he knew it was important. Then a spirit took someone from a village, grabbed them, and vanished into the spirit world, and Aang realized he had to go in after them. The problem was, he had no idea how to navigate the spirit world, and once he got there, everything became stranger and harder to control. The spirit world wasn't like the physical world. Time moved differently, and the rules didn't make sense. Aang found the spirit who'd taken the villager, Hei Bai, a forest spirit driven to rage by the destruction of its home, and tried to calm it, but words didn't work, power didn't work, and Aang was out of his depth. Finally, he figured out that Hei Bai wasn't angry for no reason. The forest had been burned during a Fire Nation raid, and the spirit was grieving. When Aang showed Hei Bai the first signs of new growth, the first shoots of bamboo coming back, the spirit calmed, released the villagers, and returned to the forest. It was another lesson in balance. Sometimes healing took time, and forcing a solution only made things worse. But the bigger event came at the Fire Temple on Crescent Island, where Avatar Roku Aang's past life had once lived and trained. Aang needed to reach the temple before the solstice ended, because Roku had something important to tell him. The fire sages who guarded the temple were supposed to help the Avatar, but most of them had been corrupted by the Fire Nation's influence. Only one of them, Xiu, stayed loyal, and he helped Aang get inside while Zuko, Zhao, and half the Fire Nation closed in from the outside. Aang made it to the inner chamber just as the solstice peaked, and Roku appeared calm, serious, and carrying the weight of 100 lifetimes. He told Aang what he needed to hear. Sozin's comet was returning at the end of summer, and when it did, the Fire Nation would use its power to finish what they started. If Aang didn't master all 4 elements by then, the war would be over, and the Fire Nation would win. That was the deadline. That was the ticking clock. Roku also showed Aang a vision of his own past, how he'd failed to stop Fire Lord Sozin before the war began, how his hesitation had cost the world 100 years of suffering. Roku's message was clear. Aang couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to be ready. After the vision ended, Aang barely escaped the temple. Roku's spirit manifested one last time to hold off Zhao and the Fire Sages, giving Aang, Katara, and Sokka the window they needed to get out. But the experience left Aang shaken. He'd been treating the Avatar role like something he'd grow into eventually, but Roku had made it clear there was no eventually. The comet was coming, and if Aang wasn't ready, everyone would die. On the way north, the group got caught in a massive storm, the kind of storm that tore ships apart and turned the ocean into a wall of water and wind. Appa struggled to stay in the air, and for a moment, it looked like they weren't going to make it. Aang went into the Avatar state to calm the storm, but the power scared him as much as it helped. He didn't understand it, didn't know how to control it, and every time it activated, it felt like he was losing himself. Katara pulled him back again, grounding him, and the storm passed. But the fear lingered. During a quieter moment after the storm, the group finally talked about Aang's past, why he'd run away from the Air Temple in the first place. Aang admitted that the monks had told him he was the Avatar earlier than they should have, that they'd started training him and isolating him and taking away the normal childhood he'd wanted. When he found out they were going to separate him from Gyatso, the one person who still treated him like a kid, Aang ran. He didn't mean to get frozen, he didn't mean to disappear for 100 years. He just wanted to escape the pressure, and the storm caught him before he could turn back. That guilt, the guilt of running, the guilt of not being there when his people were wiped out, was something Aang carried every day, and this was the first time he'd said it out loud. Katara and Sokka didn't judge him, they just listened. And in that moment, the team became more than just people traveling together. They became the people who knew each other's worst moments and chose to stay anyway. The chapter also gave us more of Zuko's unraveling. Zhao kept humiliating him, kept taking credit for Zuko's work, and kept reminding Zuko that exile meant he had no real power. Iroh tried to comfort him, tried to remind him that honor wasn't about what other people said, but Zuko couldn't hear it. He was drowning in shame, and the only thing that kept him going was the belief that if he just captured the Avatar, everything would be okay. Iroh knew that wasn't true, but he couldn't convince Zuko of that. Not yet. By the time the group set their course firmly north, toward the Northern Water Tribe, the stakes were clear. Aang needed a waterbending teacher. He needed to master at least one more element before the comet arrived. And he needed to do it fast, because the Fire Nation wasn't slowing down. Zhao was building an invasion force, Zuko was spiraling, and the world was running out of time. This chapter wasn't about big battles, it was about Aang realizing the weight of what he was carrying, about Katara and Sokka understanding what it meant to follow him, and about the clock starting to tick in a way that couldn't be ignored anymore. The Avatar's journey had turned into a race, and the finish line was a comet burning across the sky. The stretch of road between the Fire Temple and the Northern Water Tribe was long, and not every stop was worth slowing down for. There were a few detours, small problems, quick fixes, things that mattered in the moment but didn't shift the bigger picture. We'll move through these faster. At one point, the group got stuck in a canyon with two feuding tribes who refused to travel together because of some ancient grudge no one even remembered the details of anymore. Aang, tired and frustrated, just wanted everyone to get along so they could all reach the other side safely. He tried mediating, tried playing peacemaker, but the tribes kept bickering. Eventually, he made up a fake story about the ancestors of both tribes being in love, which technically worked. They stopped fighting long enough to get out of the canyon, but it wasn't exactly the Avatar's finest moment of wisdom. It was more like Aang says, whatever works to end the argument, which was very in character, but not super dignified. The takeaway: sometimes you just need to get people moving, even if the method isn't perfect. Another stop involved a fortune teller named Aunt Wu, who had an entire village convinced that her predictions were absolute fact. Sokka hated it. He didn't believe in fate, didn't believe in destiny, and thought the whole thing was a scam. Katara and Aang, though, were more open to it, especially when Aunt Wu told Katara she'd marry a powerful bender. Katara spent the rest of the episode looking at Aang a little differently, which Aang didn't notice at all because he was 12 and oblivious. The real conflict came when Aunt Wu predicted the volcano wouldn't destroy the village, and everyone just believed her, even though the volcano was clearly about to erupt. Aang and the team had to step in and save the village despite the prediction, proving that fate wasn't something you could just sit back and trust. Sokka felt vindicated. Katara kept Aunt Wu's prediction in the back of her mind. The episode was light, but it planted seeds for later. There was also the Bato of the Water Tribe detour, where Sokka and Katara ran into an old friend of their father's, and for a moment, they had the option to leave Aang and go find their dad. It wasn't a serious option. They'd already committed to the Avatar's journey, but it brought up the tension between family loyalty and the mission. Sokka especially felt the pull, because he'd spent his whole life trying to live up to his father's legacy, and here was a chance to actually be with him again. In the end, they stayed with Aang, but the moment reminded everyone that this journey had a cost, and sometimes the cost was being away from the people you loved most. Between these lighter episodes, there were a few more Fire Nation encounters, small skirmishes, narrow escapes, the usual pattern of Zuko shows up, fight happens, group escapes. None of these were huge turning points, but they kept the pressure on and reminded the audience that the chase never really stopped. Zhao's fleet was growing, and even though Zuko was still out there, He was becoming less of the main threat and more of a wild card who kept getting in everyone's way, including his own. By the time the group finally approached the Northern Water Tribe, the tone shifted. This wasn't just another stop. This was the destination they'd been aiming for since the Fire Temple, the place where Aang would finally get real waterbending training and Katara could learn from actual masters instead of a stolen scroll. The Northern Water Tribe was massive, an entire city built into ice and snow, protected by walls and warriors and a culture that had survived 100 years of war by staying isolated and defensive. When they arrived, the reception was big. The chief welcomed them. The people celebrated the Avatar's arrival, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were somewhere safe. But safety came with rules, and those rules hit Katara hard. The Northern Water Tribe had strict traditions about gender and bending. Men learned combat waterbending, women learned healing. Katara, who had been teaching herself combat moves and fighting alongside Aang the whole journey, was told she couldn't train with the warriors. She was sent to learn healing with the other women, and she hated it. Aang, meanwhile, got assigned to Master Pakku, the best waterbending teacher in the tribe and one of the most rigid, traditional figures they'd met. Pakku was skilled, no question, but he didn't like being questioned, didn't like bending the rules, and definitely didn't like the idea of teaching a girl combat waterbending when Katara demanded to be included. The clash between Katara's drive and Pakku's traditions became one of the key tensions of this era, and it wouldn't resolve easily. Sokka, during this time, met Yue, the Northern Water Tribe princess. She was kind, beautiful, and clearly interested in him, but she was also engaged to someone else in an arranged political marriage. Sokka tried to respect that, but the connection between them was immediate and obvious, and it complicated things in a way Sokka wasn't used to. He'd had crushes before Suki on Kyoshi Island, for example, but Yue felt different, more real, more impossible. While the group settled in and tried to navigate the politics and traditions of the Northern Water Tribe, the Fire Nation was moving. Zhao's invasion fleet was on its way, and the Northern Water Tribe was the target. This wasn't going to be a small raid. This was going to be a siege, a full-scale assault designed to break the last major Water Tribe stronghold and take away the Avatar's chance to master waterbending. The group didn't know the exact timeline yet, but the signs were there. Ships were gathering, armies were moving, and Zhao, backed by the Fire Nation's full military power, was coming for them. This chapter was about the final stretch before everything exploded. The lighter episodes kept the tone from getting too heavy, but they also reminded the audience that even in a war, life kept happening. People fell in love, argued about fate, tried to reconnect with family, and then the serious weight came back in. Traditions that felt outdated, a city preparing for war, and the knowledge that the Fire Nation wasn't going to let the Avatar train in peace. The clock that had started ticking at the Fire Temple was almost out of time, and the Northern Water Tribe was about to become the battleground that would define the rest of Aang's first year awake. The Fire Nation fleet appeared on the horizon just after dawn, massive, organized, and close enough that you could see the smoke from the ship's engines. Zhao had brought everything: warships, trebuchets, firebenders, and enough soldiers to overwhelm a city that had never been successfully invaded. The Northern Water Tribe's walls were strong, their warriors were ready, and their waterbenders had home field advantage, but this wasn't a fight they could win through defense alone. This was survival. The battle started with fire. Zhao's fleet launched flaming projectiles at the ice walls, and the waterbenders worked around the clock to repair the damage, freeze the ocean, and hold the line. Aang joined the fight immediately, using his airbending to knock fireballs out of the sky and his waterbending still rough, still learning to support the tribe's defense. Katara fought alongside the men despite Pakku's earlier refusal to train her, and when Pakku saw her skill in actual combat, he finally backed down and acknowledged that the rules didn't matter anymore. The war was here, and everyone who could fight needed to fight. Sokka took a different role. He wasn't a bender, so he couldn't hold the front line, but he could think, plan, and move through the chaos in ways others couldn't. He coordinated with the warriors, set traps, and kept an eye on the bigger picture, while everyone else focused on the immediate threat. Yue stayed close to him when she could, but she had responsibilities too. Her father needed her. The people needed to see their princess staying strong, and Yue was trying to balance all of that with the growing certainty that something worse was coming. Zuko, meanwhile, wasn't with Zhao's fleet. He'd been left behind, humiliated, and sidelined once again, but he refused to let that stop him. He snuck into the Northern Water Tribe on his own, moving through the chaos of the battle with one goal: capture the Avatar. It was a desperate move, reckless even by Zuko's standards, but he didn't care. This was his last chance to restore his honor, and he wasn't going to let Zhao take it from him. While the battle raged outside, Zhao pursued a darker plan. He'd learned about the moon and ocean spirits Tui and La, who lived in physical form in the spirit oasis, at the heart of the city. The moon spirit gave waterbenders their power, and Zhao believed that killing it would cripple the water tribe and guarantee the Fire Nation's victory. Iroh, who had joined Zhao's fleet under protest, warned him that destroying a spirit would have consequences beyond anything Zhao could imagine. Zhao didn't listen. He was too close to his victory to care about balance or consequences. Aang, feeling the spiritual disturbance, went into the spirit world to find answers. While his body sat defenseless in the spirit oasis, Katara and Yue stayed to protect him. That's when Zuko showed up. He fought Katara, grabbed Aang's body, and disappeared into the frozen tunnels beneath the city. Katara chased him, desperate to get Aang back before it was too late, and the two of them clashed in a series of brutal, exhausting fights across the ice. Zuko was skilled and relentless, but Katara had been training non-stop, and she'd grown strong enough to hold her own. Eventually, Zuko collapsed from exhaustion and cold, and Katara brought Aang back to the oasis just as he returned from the spirit world. But by then, Zhao had already reached the spirit oasis. He captured the moon spirit, a koi fish glowing white in the pool, and held it above the water, threatening to kill it. Iroh stepped in, furious, and told Zhao that killing the moon would throw the entire world out of balance, that even the Fire Nation would suffer. For a moment, Zhao hesitated, then he killed it anyway. The moon went dark. Waterbending stopped working. The entire battlefield fell silent as both sides realized what had just happened. The Fire Nation had won, but the cost was something no one had prepared for. The ocean spirit, La, reacted immediately. It merged with Aang, who was still in the Avatar state, and together they became a massive, glowing force of water and rage. The combined spirit tore through Zhao's fleet, sinking ships and scattering soldiers, unstoppable and terrifying in a way that made it clear this wasn't just bending anymore. This was the wrath of the world itself. Yue, watching the destruction and feeling the absence of the moon, realized what she had to do. She'd been sick as a child, dying, and the moon spirit had saved her life by giving her some of its essence. That's why her hair was white. That's why she felt connected to the moon in a way no one else did. She told Sokka she had to give that life back, that it was the only way to restore balance and save everyone. Sokka begged her not to, tried to find another way, but Yue had already made her choice. She touched the koi fish, and her life force flowed into it. The moon spirit returned, the moon reappeared in the sky, and Yue's body went still. She didn't disappear completely. Her spirit became part of the moon, and for a moment, she appeared to Sokka one last time, glowing, peaceful, and gone. Sokka kissed her, said goodbye, and then she faded into the light. It was the first real loss the group had faced, and it hit Sokka harder than anything else in the war so far. Zhao, meanwhile, was dragged into the ocean by the ocean spirit during the chaos. Zuko, who had been nearby, reached out to save him, but Zhao refused. He slapped Zuko's hand away, choosing pride over survival, and the spirit pulled him under. Zhao was gone, erased by the same forces he'd tried to destroy. When the battle ended, the Fire Nation's fleet was shattered. The Northern Water Tribe had survived, and the Avatar had proven again that messing with the balance of the world came with consequences. But the victory felt hollow. Yue was dead, the city was damaged, and even though they'd won, the Fire Nation was still out there, still planning, still coming. Aang stood by the oasis afterward, shaken by the power he channeled and the destruction it had caused. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a weapon, and that scared him. Katara tried to comfort him, but she was grieving too for Yue, for the people they'd lost, for the weight they were all carrying now. Sokka didn't say much. He just stared at the moon, quiet and distant, processing a loss that no one could fix. The siege was over, but the war wasn't. The Fire Nation had been pushed back, but they'd also learned that the Avatar was dangerous in ways they hadn't fully understood before, and the group had learned that winning didn't always feel like winning, especially when the cost was someone you cared about. The Northern Water Tribe had held, but the world was still burning, and the comet was still coming. This chapter closed with the group preparing to leave, to keep moving, because staying still wasn't an option anymore. The war had escalated, and so had they. After the siege, the Northern Water Tribe needed time to rebuild, and the group couldn't stay. Aang had learned enough waterbending to get by, he wasn't a master yet, but he could hold his own, and the next element on the list was Earth. That meant heading into Earth Kingdom territory, finding a teacher, and hoping they could stay ahead of the Fire Nation long enough to make it happen. Master Paku gave Katara his blessing to continue her training on her own, acknowledging that she'd already surpassed most of his students. It wasn't the formal ending she'd hoped for, but it was respect, and that mattered. Sokka left the North quietly, still processing Yue's death. He didn't talk about it much, didn't let it slow him down, but you could see it in the way he looked at the sky at night, the way he went quiet when the moon was full. Katara noticed, but she gave him space. Some grief couldn't be rushed. The immediate problem was that the Avatar state, the power Aang had tapped into during the siege, was unpredictable and dangerous. Aang didn't know how to control it, didn't even fully understand what it was. All he knew was that when it activated, he stopped being himself and became something older, angrier, and capable of destroying entire fleets. That scared him. The idea of losing control, of hurting people he cared about, made him hesitate to rely on that power even when he needed it. It was something he'd have to figure out eventually, but for now, it was just another weight on his shoulders. Back in the Fire Nation, things were shifting. Zuko returned home in disgrace. He'd failed to capture the Avatar again, and worse, he'd lost Zhao's favor and his uncle's trust. When he arrived back at the Fire Nation capital, he expected exile to continue, maybe even punishment. What he didn't expect was his sister. Azula was everything Zuko wasn't: calm, controlled, confident, and terrifyingly skilled. She was a firebending prodigy, a tactical genius, and their father's favorite. When she showed up to escort Zuko home, it was immediately clear this wasn't a gesture of kindness. Fire Lord Ozai had sent Azula to bring Zuko and Iroh back, but not because he forgave them. He had plans, and those plans involved using Zuko in ways that wouldn't end well for him. Iroh didn't trust Azula. He'd seen how their family worked, how Ozai manipulated and discarded people, and he knew that going back to the Fire Nation wasn't going to give Zuko the redemption he wanted. But Zuko, desperate for his father's approval, wanted to believe. He wanted to think that maybe, finally, he'd done enough to earn his place back. Iroh tried to warn him, tried to slow him down, but Zuko was already on the ship heading home. Azula, though, had her own mission beyond just retrieving Zuko. Fire Lord Ozai had tasked her with hunting the Avatar, and unlike Zuko, she wasn't working alone. She'd handpicked two companions: Mai, a bored, deadpan weapons expert who moved like a shadow and threw knives with perfect precision, and Tai Li, an acrobatic Kai blocker who could disable bending with a few quick jabs to pressure points. Together, the three of them were faster, smarter, and more dangerous than anything the group had faced before. Where Zuko had been obsessive and emotional, Azula was patient and calculating. She didn't chase the Avatar out of desperation, she hunted him because it was a job, and she was very good at her job. That shift in the Fire Nation's pursuit changed everything. The group wasn't just running from an angry prince anymore. They were being tracked by a team that could outthink them, outfight them, and predict their moves before they made them. As the group flew south toward the Earth Kingdom, they started hearing rumors. The Fire Nation was advancing. More territory was falling. The Earth Kingdom's military was struggling to hold the line, and the safe zones were shrinking. It became clear that finding an earthbending teacher wasn't going to be a simple matter of showing up and asking nicely. The Earth Kingdom was in chaos, and navigating that chaos while avoiding Azula's team was going to take everything they had. Aang felt the pressure building. He had waterbending down mostly, but Earth was next, and he didn't know where to start. The problem wasn't just finding a teacher, it was finding the right teacher, someone who could teach him the way earthbenders thought, not just the moves. Bumi had hinted at that back in Omashu, but Omashu was occupied now, and Bumi was unreachable. They were on their own. Katara kept training, kept pushing herself, because she knew that the next stretch of the journey was going to be harder than anything they'd done before. She wasn't just Aang's waterbending coach anymore, she was one of the strongest benders in the group, and that responsibility weighed on her. Sokka, meanwhile, doubled down on strategy. He couldn't fight Azula with bending, but he could outthink her, or at least try to. He started mapping their route, planning contingencies, and keeping the group moving in ways that were harder to predict. The first few days into Earth Kingdom territory were tense. Every town they passed through felt like it could be a trap. Every stranger could be a Fire Nation spy. And somewhere behind them, Azula was moving, closing the distance, learning their patterns. The group didn't know exactly when she'd catch up, but they knew it was only a matter of time. This chapter wasn't about big battles or dramatic revelations. It was about the shift in the hunt. Zuko, for all his flaws, had been predictable. Azula wasn't. She was the Fire Nation's best, and she was coming for them with precision, patience, and a team that didn't make mistakes. The group had survived the siege, but the war wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was speeding up, and the next phase, earthbending, Azula, and the growing pressure of the comet deadline was going to test them in ways the first season hadn't. The Northern Water Tribe had been the end of one era. Now, as they flew toward the Earth Kingdom with new enemies on their trail, the next era was beginning, and it wasn't going to be gentle. The Earth Kingdom felt different from the Water Tribes. It was bigger, denser, and the war had carved through it in ways that left scars on every town and every road. The group landed in a military outpost first, hoping to find information about earthbending teachers or at least safe places to rest. What they found instead was General Fong, an Earth Kingdom commander who was less interested in helping Aang train and more interested in using him as a weapon. Fong had heard about the Avatar state, the glowing, unstoppable power Aang had unleashed during the siege, and he wanted to trigger it again. His logic was simple. If the Avatar could enter that state on command, the war would be over. Just point Aang at the Fire Nation and let him destroy everything in his path. Aang tried to explain that he couldn't control the Avatar state, that it only activated when he was in extreme danger or emotional distress. But Fong didn't care. He wanted results, and he was willing to push Aang to the breaking point to get them. Fong set up a series of tests designed to make Aang angry, scared, or desperate enough to trigger the state. He trapped Katara and Sokka, staged fake attacks, and kept escalating until Aang finally snapped. The Avatar state activated, but it wasn't the controlled weapon Fong had hoped for. It was raw chaos. Aang's eyes glowed, the wind tore through the camp, and the ground cracked beneath him. Katara had to pull him out of it again, and when Aang came back to himself, he was horrified. He'd almost destroyed the entire base, almost hurt his friends, and Fong still didn't understand why that was a problem. The group left the outpost shaken. Aang made a decision then. He wasn't going to rely on the Avatar state. He couldn't trust it, couldn't control it, and using it felt like giving up part of himself. That decision would matter later, but for now, it was just Aang trying to hold on to who he was instead of becoming a weapon. They kept moving, hitting smaller Earth Kingdom towns, and the pattern was always the same. Fire Nation occupation, resistance fighters barely holding on, people who'd given up hope, or people clinging to it too hard. One town had a resistance leader who wanted Aang to liberate them immediately, and when Aang explained that he couldn't fight an entire garrison alone, the leader turned bitter, accused him of being a coward, and sent them away. It wasn't fair, but it was real. People needed hope, but hope didn't always look the way they wanted it to. During one of these stops, they heard about an underground earthbending tournament in a place called Earth Rumble V. It was illegal, unsanctioned, and full of the best earthbenders in the region fighting for reputation and prize money. Aang figured if he wanted to find a powerful earthbending teacher, this was the place to start, so they went. The tournament was loud, chaotic, and brutal. Earthbenders fought in a ring, slamming rocks and dirt at each other until one of them couldn't get back up. The fighters had names like the Boulder and the Hippo, and they played up the spectacle, but the bending was real. Aang watched fight after fight, looking for someone who could teach him, and then the final champion stepped into the ring. Toph Beifong was 12 years old, blind, and the most powerful earthbender Aang had ever seen. She fought under the name the Blind Bandit, and she destroyed every opponent with precision and confidence that didn't match her size or age. She used earthbending to see through vibrations in the ground, feeling every step, every shift, every attack before it came. She was small, blunt, and didn't care what anyone thought of her. Aang knew immediately she was the one. The problem was convincing her. Toph came from a wealthy, overprotective family who had no idea she was sneaking out to fight in underground tournaments. Her parents saw her as fragile, helpless, someone who needed constant supervision because of her blindness. They'd hired earthbending instructors to teach her basic moves, but they had no idea she'd surpassed every earthbender in the region. Toph hated the way her parents treated her, hated being underestimated, and she wasn't interested in leaving her life behind to teach some kid she didn't know. Aang tried to talk to her, tried to explain that he needed her, but Toph shut him down. She didn't owe him anything, and she wasn't interested in being the Avatar's teacher just because he asked nicely. The conversation went nowhere, and the group left frustrated. But that same night, Toph's parents confronted her after finding out about the tournament. They didn't yell, they just tightened the restrictions, made it clear they were going to keep her even more isolated, and Toph realized she had a choice: stay and suffocate, or leave. When Aang's group was attacked by Fire Nation soldiers sent by Azula's intelligence network, Toph showed up, helped them fight, and made her decision. She joined the group, not because she believed in the Avatar's mission, but because she wanted freedom, and this was her only way out. Toph's addition changed the group's dynamic immediately. She was blunt where Katara was careful, reckless where Sokka was cautious, and she didn't do sentiment or group hugs. She also didn't take orders well, which created friction right away, but her earthbending was undeniable, and Aang needed her. The first training session was a disaster. Aang's instinct as an airbender was to be light, evasive, always moving. Earthbending required the opposite: standing your ground, confronting problems head-on, being immovable. Toph tried to teach him, but Aang kept flinching, kept dodging, kept doing everything wrong. She got frustrated, he got defensive, and the lesson ended with both of them annoyed. It became clear that learning earthbending wasn't going to be quick. Aang's natural personality clashed with the element itself, and Toph wasn't the kind of teacher who coddled her students. She pushed, she challenged, and she didn't care if Aang's feelings got hurt in the process. That tension would take time to resolve, but it was also exactly what Aang needed. He couldn't just charm his way through earthbending the way he had with water and air. He had to change the way he thought, and Toph was the only one stubborn enough to make him do it. Meanwhile, Azula's hunt continued. She was tracking them through informants, through patterns in their movements, and through the chaos they left behind. Every time the group helped a town or got into a fight, it left a trail, and Azula was following it methodically. She wasn't rushing, she was just waiting for the right moment to strike. Back with Zuko and Iroh, things were falling apart. Zuko had realized his sister wasn't bringing them home out of kindness, she was bringing them back as prisoners, or worse. He and Iroh escaped Azula's custody and went on the run, officially becoming fugitives of the Fire Nation. Zuko's entire identity had been built around returning home with honor, and now that path was gone. He didn't know who he was anymore, and Iroh was trying to help him figure it out, but Zuko wasn't ready to listen. This chapter was about transitions. Aang had found his earthbending teacher, but learning from her was going to be harder than anything he'd faced before. Toph had joined the group, but she hadn't fully committed to the mission, she was just along for the ride. Katara and Sokka were adjusting to having someone new in the group who didn't follow the same emotional rhythms they did, and Azula was closing in, patient and precise, waiting for the moment when the group let their guard down. The foundation for the next phase of the journey was set, and the training, brutal, frustrating, necessary, was about to begin. Azula found them faster than expected. The group had stopped to rest in a small Earth Kingdom forest, trying to recover from days of non-stop travel, and Azula's team hit them in the middle of the night. It wasn't a fair fight, it was an ambush designed to scatter them, exhaust them, and keep them from settling anywhere long enough to train or plan. Azula brought Mai and Ty Lee, and the three of them moved like they'd been working together their entire lives. Mai's knives came from the shadows, Ty Lee flipped through defenses and blocked bending with surgical precision, and Azula's blue fire cut through the darkness with terrifying accuracy. The group barely escaped. They got onto Appa and flew away, but Azula didn't let them go. She tracked them, followed them, and every time they landed to sleep or eat or rest, she attacked again. It became a pattern: land, get ambushed, escape, fly, repeat. The exhaustion piled up fast. No one was sleeping. Conversations got shorter and sharper, tempers flared over nothing. Appa was tired, Momo was stressed, and the group, which had been functioning pretty well up until this point, started to crack. Toph was the first to snap. She didn't care about the Fire Nation, didn't care about Azula, and didn't understand why they kept running instead of just standing and fighting. She wanted to set a trap, ambush Azula back, and end this chase on their terms. Katara disagreed. She thought the smartest move was to keep moving and avoid confrontation until they were stronger. Sokka tried to mediate, but he was too tired to think clearly, and Aang just wanted everyone to stop yelling. The argument went nowhere, and the group kept running. During one of the escapes, they lost Appa's saddle, which had most of their supplies. It was a small thing, but it mattered. They didn't have food, they didn't have water, they didn't have the maps or tools Sokka relied on to plan their route. Everything was stripped down to basics, and the stress kept building. The chase finally ended when the group found an abandoned town and decided to make a stand. They were too tired to keep running, and Appa couldn't fly another mile without collapsing. Azula showed up right on schedule, and the fight that followed was messy and desperate. Aang, Katara, Toph, and Sokka fought as hard as they could, but Azula's team had the advantage. They were rested, coordinated, and in control. The group was falling apart. Then Zuko and Iroh showed up. They weren't there to help, they were there because they'd been tracking the Avatar too, hoping to capture him before Azula did. But when Zuko saw his sister, saw the way she was hunting Aang with the same cold precision their father used, something shifted in him. He didn't join Aang's side, but he didn't join Azula either. He just fought everyone, creating enough chaos that the whole situation collapsed into a messy, multi-sided brawl that no one could win. Eventually, Azula pulled back. She wasn't interested in a drawn-out fight where she couldn't control the variables, and with Zuko interfering, the situation was too chaotic. She left, but not before making it clear this wasn't over. The group, meanwhile, barely had the energy to celebrate. They just collapsed in the ruins of the town, too exhausted to move. That night, the group finally talked. Really talked. Toph admitted she didn't trust anyone in the group yet, that she was used to doing things alone and didn't know how to rely on people. Katara admitted she was scared of Azula, scared they weren't strong enough, scared that all the pressure was getting to Aang and he'd break under it. Sokka admitted he felt useless, that everyone else had bending and he just had a boomerang and a brain, and sometimes that didn't feel like enough. Aang admitted he was terrified of the Avatar state, terrified of losing control, and terrified that he'd let everyone down if he couldn't master earthbending in time. The conversation didn't fix everything, but it helped. They understood each other better. They knew what everyone was carrying, and that made the weight a little easier to share. When they finally slept that night, it was the first real rest they'd had in days. The next phase of training started after the chase ended. Toph took Aang into the wilderness and put him through bitter work earthbending training that was designed to break his airbender instincts and force him to think like an earthbender. She made him stand in front of a boulder and push it. Not dodge it, not move around it, push it. Aang failed over and over. He flinched, he sidestepped, he tried to air blast it away. Toph got frustrated. Aang got defensive, and the lesson kept failing. The breakthrough came when Sokka was in danger. A saber-toothed moose lion attacked their camp, and Aang's instinct to protect his friend overrode his instinct to run. He stood his ground, didn't flinch, and earthbended a wall between Sokka and the creature. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Toph saw it and finally nodded. "That's earthbending," she said. From there, the training got easier. Not easier. Aang was still learning, still struggling, but he'd figured out the mental shift he needed to make, and that was the hardest part. While Aang trained, Katara kept practicing her waterbending, refining techniques and pushing herself to be faster, stronger, more versatile. She knew Azula was out there, knew they'd fight again, and she wasn't going to be the weak link. Sokka, meanwhile, worked on his strategic mind. He couldn't bend, but he could think, and he started developing plans for how to fight Azula's team if they couldn't avoid the next encounter. Toph also started teaching Aang a skill she'd invented, metal bending. It wasn't something most earthbenders could do, most didn't even think it was possible, but Toph had figured it out by sensing the impurities in metal, the tiny fragments of earth still inside it. Aang tried, but he couldn't get it. Metal bending required a level of precision and connection to earth that he didn't have yet. Toph wasn't surprised. She told him it was fine, that earthbending was enough for now, but the seed was planted. Bending could evolve, could go beyond what people thought was possible. Zuko and Iroh, meanwhile, were dealing with their own fallout. They were fugitives now, wanted by both the Earth Kingdom and the Fire Nation. Iroh was calm about it. He'd been preparing for this, in a way, teaching Zuko survival skills and trying to steer him toward a new path. But Zuko was angry. He'd lost everything. His home, his father's approval, his mission, his identity. He didn't know what he was supposed to do now, and Iroh's gentle guidance felt like pity. They kept moving, kept surviving, but the tension between them was growing. This chapter was about the group breaking under pressure and then slowly rebuilding. The chase had exposed all their weaknesses, all the places where they didn't trust each other or themselves, and the conversations that followed started to fix those cracks. Aang's earthbending breakthrough was important, but the emotional breakthrough, learning to rely on each other, learning to be honest about fear, mattered just as much. Azula was still out there, still hunting, but the group was stronger now. Not invincible, not perfect, but stronger. And they were going to need that strength, because the next stretch of the journey was going to test them in ways the chase hadn't. The swamp appeared out of nowhere, massive, dense, and wrong in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. It wasn't on the maps, and it didn't feel like the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. Appa flew over it, and then something pulled them down, not physically, but spiritually, like the swamp wanted them there. They crashed into the water, got separated in the mist and vines, and spent hours trying to find each other while the swamp messed with their heads. Aang saw visions of people he didn't recognize yet, flashes of faces, voices, moments that hadn't happened. Katara saw her mother, heard her voice, and chased it through the trees even though she knew it wasn't real. Sokka saw Yue, and the grief he'd been pushing down came rushing back. Toph, who didn't see the way everyone else did, wasn't affected by the visual hallucinations. But she felt the swamp differently, felt the life in it, the way everything was connected under the surface. When they finally reunited, they met the swamp's inhabitants, waterbenders, who lived in the swamp and had adapted their bending to the plants and vines around them. The swamp people explained that the visions weren't just tricks. The swamp was deeply connected to the spirit world, and it showed people what they needed to see, whether they wanted to see it or not. The people Aang had seen, the ones he didn't recognize, were people he'd meet later, connections that were already forming even if they hadn't crossed paths yet. It was strange, unsettling, and another reminder that being the Avatar meant being tied to forces bigger than just politics and war. The group left the swamp quieter than they'd entered it. The visions had stirred up things they didn't talk about: grief, fear, longing, and no one wanted to unpack all of that in the middle of the journey. They just kept moving. The next major stop was a library buried in the desert, Wan Shi Tong's library, a massive spirit world structure that had manifested in the physical world and collected knowledge from across history. The group found it by accident while searching for information about the Fire Nation's plans, and when they stepped inside, it felt like stepping out of the war entirely. The library was vast, quiet, and filled with more scrolls and books than they could read in a lifetime. Sokka was in heaven. He'd spent the whole journey feeling like the least important member of the team, and here was a place where knowledge mattered more than bending. He dove into the research, looking for anything that could give them an advantage in the war, and eventually, he found it, a report about a solar eclipse that had happened years ago. During the eclipse, firebenders had lost their power completely, and the day had been marked as a day of mourning in Fire Nation history. The implications hit immediately. If they could find out when the next solar eclipse was, they could plan an invasion. The Fire Nation would be defenseless, and the Earth Kingdom could strike at the heart of the Fire Nation without facing firebending resistance. It was the first concrete plan they'd had since the journey started, the first real hope that they could actually win this war. But Wan Shi Tong, the spirit who owned the library, wasn't happy. He'd allowed humans into his library on the condition that they seek knowledge for its own sake, not to use it for violence. When he realized Sokka was planning to weaponize the eclipse information, Wan Shi Tong got angry. The library started sinking into the desert, and the spirit made it clear. He didn't want his knowledge used for war, and he was going to bury the library so no one could abuse it again. The group barely escaped. They grabbed what they could and ran, but in the chaos, Appa was taken. A group of sandbenders had been waiting outside the library, and when the group was distracted, they stole the sky bison and sold him. By the time Aang realized what had happened, Appa was gone, dragged across the desert by people who saw him as property, not family. Aang's reaction was immediate and devastating. Appa wasn't just transportation, he was Aang's oldest friend, the last living connection to the Air Nomads, and the one constant in a world that had taken everything else. Losing Appa felt like losing the last piece of home, and Aang couldn't handle it. His grief turned to rage, and he lashed out at everyone at Toph for not stopping the Sandbenders, at the universe for taking one more thing from him, at himself for not protecting Appa when it mattered. The group had the eclipse information, the key to possibly ending the war, but none of that mattered in the moment. Appa was gone, and Aang was breaking. This chapter wasn't about victories or progress. It was about loss, about the cost of the journey, and about the realization that even when you find hope, the war finds ways to take things from you. The swamp had shown them visions of connection, the library had given them a plan, and the desert had taken away the one thing Aang couldn't afford to lose. The group was standing in the sand with a piece of paper that could change the war, and all Aang could think about was the empty sky where Appa should have been. The desert was brutal. No water, no shade, no clear direction. Just sand, heat, and the suffocating weight of everything that had just happened. The group needed to cross the desert to reach the nearest Earth Kingdom city, but without Appa, they were walking. And walking in the desert meant dying slowly unless you knew what you were doing. Sokka tried to keep everyone moving, tried to ration the little water they had left, but the heat was relentless, and the group was falling apart. Aang was barely functional. He kept scanning the horizon for Appa, kept muttering about going back to find him, and refused to accept that the Sky Bison was gone. His grief made him reckless. He wanted to chase the Sandbenders immediately, wanted to tear across the desert until he found Appa, and he didn't care if it killed him. Katara tried to calm him down, tried to remind him that they'd all die if they didn't stick together, but Aang wasn't listening. He was drowning in loss, and nothing anyone said could pull him out. Sokka, meanwhile, was struggling in a different way. He'd accidentally drunk cactus juice early in the trek, thought it would help with hydration, and it turned out to be a hallucinogen. He spent hours stumbling through the sand, talking nonsense, seeing things that weren't there, and generally being useless. Under normal circumstances, it might have been funny. In the middle of a life-or-death desert crossing, it was just another problem Katara had to manage. Toph was doing her best, but the sand made her earthbending nearly useless. She couldn't see through sand the way she could through solid earth. It shifted too much, didn't hold shape, and left her functionally blind in a way she wasn't used to. She tried to keep up, tried to help navigate, but she was scared in a way she didn't know how to admit. The desert stripped away the one thing that made her powerful, and without it, she was just a kid trying not to get lost. Katara held the group together. She was the only one still thinking clearly, still managing resources, still keeping everyone alive. She rationed water, kept Sokka from wandering off, reminded Toph to stay close, and kept trying to reach Aang even though he wasn't ready to be reached. It was exhausting, and the weight of being the only functional person in the group was crushing her, but she didn't let it show. Someone had to stay strong, and it wasn't going to be anyone else. The group encountered a massive sandstorm, and in the middle of it, they found a small group of sandbenders traveling through. Aang recognized them, or thought he did, and confronted them, demanding to know where Appa was. The sandbenders admitted they'd traded Appa to merchants heading toward Ba Sing Se, and Aang snapped. The Avatar state activated, and the wind and sand exploded outward in a wave of uncontrolled rage. The sandbenders were thrown back, and the storm intensified, and for a moment, it looked like Aang was going to kill them. Katara grabbed him, pulled him close, and talked him down. She didn't lecture him, didn't tell him he was wrong to be angry. She just held onto him and let him break, let him cry, let him feel the grief he'd been pushing down since the library. When the glow faded and Aang came back to himself, he was quiet, drained, and ashamed. The sandbenders were gone, and the group was alone again. They kept walking. Days blurred together, the heat, the thirst, the exhaustion, it all stacked up until walking became automatic, mindless. Momo, Aang's lemur, disappeared at one point, and the group thought they'd lost him too, but he came back carrying food he'd scavenged from somewhere. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Even Momo was trying to keep them alive. Eventually, they made it out of the desert. They reached the edge of the sand and collapsed in the first patch of grass they found, too tired to celebrate, too relieved to do anything but sleep. When they woke up, they were near a small Earth Kingdom outpost, and the immediate danger was over. But the cost of the desert was clear. Aang had broken, Katara was exhausted, Sokka was still recovering from the cactus juice disaster, and Toph had spent days terrified and unable to help. The group had survived, but they'd been stripped down to nothing in the process. The desert chapter wasn't about action or plot. It was about endurance, about what happens when you lose the thing that makes you feel safe, and about how hard it is to keep moving when everything in you wants to stop. Aang had learned that grief didn't go away just because you had a mission. Katara had learned that being strong for everyone else could break you if you didn't let someone else help, and the group had learned that survival sometimes meant just putting one foot in front of the other until the landscape changed. They were out of the desert, but they weren't okay yet, and somewhere ahead, in Ba Sing Se, Appa was waiting if they could find him before it was too late. The outer wall of Ba Sing Se was massive, taller than anything the group had seen, stretching for miles in both directions, and marked with the scars of 100 years of war. This was the last great Earth Kingdom stronghold, the city that had never fallen, and the place where refugees from across the kingdom came hoping for safety. The group arrived exhausted, grieving, and desperate to find Appa. But getting into the city wasn't simple. First, they had to pass through the outer ring, where the refugees waited in camps for permission to enter. The conditions were rough, overcrowded, under-resourced, and filled with people who'd lost everything to the Fire Nation. Aang saw families that reminded him of the towns they'd passed through, the villages they'd tried to help, and the weight of it all hit him again. These people were here because the war had taken their homes, and the Avatar him hadn't stopped it yet. At the refugee processing center, they met Jet again. The same freedom fighter who'd tried to flood a town back in Season 1, the one Katara had trusted and then been betrayed by. Jet claimed he'd changed, that he wasn't the same person anymore, and that he wanted to help them get into the city. Katara didn't trust him, Sokka didn't either, but they needed help, and Jet had connections, so they let him guide them carefully. Jet's information about the city was useful. He explained how Ba Sing Se worked. 3 rings, each more protected than the last. The outer ring for refugees and workers, the middle ring for merchants and citizens, and the inner ring for the wealthy and the Earth King's palace. Movement between the rings was tightly controlled, and the city's secret police, the Dai Li, made sure no one caused trouble or spread disrupting information. On the surface, Ba Sing Se looked like a functioning city. Underneath, it was a place where the truth was carefully managed. The group made it into the outer ring and immediately started searching for Appa. They put up posters, asked around, followed leads, but nothing panned out. The city was huge, and one sky bison could be anywhere or already gone. Aang's hope was fading, and the longer they searched, the more desperate he became. Then, the Fire Nation attacked. Not with an army with a drill, a massive, mobile siege weapon designed to punch through Ba Sing Se's outer wall, led by Azula. The drill was enormous, covered in armor, and moving steadily toward the wall while the city's defenses scrambled to stop it. If the drill breached the wall, the Fire Nation could pour troops into the outer ring, and Ba Sing Se's impenetrable reputation would be shattered. The group joined the defense. Aang, Katara, Sokka, and Toph fought their way onto the drill, sabotaging it from the inside while the Earth Kingdom's army tried to slow it from the outside. The fight was brutal. Azula, Mai, and Ty Lee were inside the drill, defending it, and every encounter with them was a reminder of how outmatched the group still was. Azula's lightning, Mai's precision, Ty Lee's key blocking it all added up to a team that was just better, and the group had to rely on tactics and environment to survive. Sokka came up with the plan: hit the drill's support beams from the inside, then strike the outer shell from above to create a weak point. It was risky, required perfect timing, and depended on Aang delivering the final blow. They executed it under fire, with Azula hunting them through the drill's interior, and barely pulled it off. The drill collapsed, the wall held, and the Fire Nation's siege weapon was destroyed. Azula retreated, but not before making it clear this was just one move in a longer game. The city celebrated the victory, but the group didn't feel like celebrating. They'd stopped the drill, but Appa was still missing, and the city's leadership didn't seem interested in helping them find him. Worse, they started noticing something strange about Ba Sing Se. No one talked about the war, not openly. Refugees were told to stay quiet about their experiences, and anyone who mentioned the Fire Nation too loudly was invited to Lake Laogai for re-education. The Dai Li, the secret police, controlled information flow, and the city's illusion of peace was built on keeping people ignorant. Ju Di, a smiling government guide assigned to help the group, followed them everywhere and redirected every conversation away from the war. When they asked about the Earth King, she told them he was unavailable. When they asked about military strategy, she changed the subject. When they pushed too hard, she disappeared and was replaced by another woman, also named Ju Di, who acted like nothing had happened. It was creepy, unsettling, and a clear sign that something was very wrong with this city. Zuko and Iroh, meanwhile, had made it to Ba Sing Se as well. They were living in the lower ring under fake names, trying to blend in and start a new life. Iroh opened a tea shop, and for the first time in years, Zuko had the option to just be normal. No hunting, no missions, no Fire Nation pressure. Just tea, customers, and quiet days. Iroh was content. Zuko was miserable. He didn't know how to be normal, didn't know who he was without his mission, and the idea of serving tea for the rest of his life felt like giving up. Jet, during this time, spotted Iroh using firebending to heat tea and realized he and Zuko were Fire Nation. Jet tried to warn the group, tried to tell them there were Fire Nation spies in the city, but no one believed him. He'd lied before, manipulated before, and even though he was telling the truth this time, his past made it impossible for anyone to trust him. The Dai Li arrested Jet, took him to Lake Laogai, and he disappeared into the same system that had been silencing refugees and dissidents since the war began. The group kept searching for Appa, and eventually they found a lead, a seller in the middle ring who claimed to have information. The trail led them deeper into the city's underbelly, past the polite fiction of peace and into the places where the Dai Li's control was absolute. And somewhere in that labyrinth of secrets and lies, Appa was waiting if they could reach him before the city buried the truth completely. Ba Sing Se had promised safety, but it was starting to feel like a different kind of trap. The search for Appa led the group to Lake Laogai, a place that didn't officially exist. It wasn't on any map, wasn't mentioned in any guide, and asking about it too loudly got you noticed by the Dai Li. But the group kept digging, kept following the few leads they had, and eventually they found it. An underground facility hidden beneath the lake where the Dai Li took people to adjust their thinking. Inside, the facility was sterile and wrong. People sat in rows, staring blankly, repeating phrases like, "There is no war in Ba Sing Se," over and over until they believed it. This was where the city's illusion of peace was manufactured through brainwashing, through erasing memories, through turning refugees and dissidents into obedient citizens who didn't ask questions. The group had suspected the Dai Li were controlling information, but seeing the scale of it, seeing people's minds wiped clean, was something else entirely. They found Jet in one of the cells, confused and barely coherent after days of conditioning. He recognized them, tried to warn them about something, but his thoughts were fractured, and the Dai Li didn't give them time to sort it out. The agents attacked, and the fight that followed was brutal. Dai Li agents were elite earthbenders, trained to fight in tight spaces and neutralize threats without causing public scenes. They used rock gloves, stone restraints, and coordinated strikes that made them far more dangerous than regular Earth Kingdom soldiers. During the fight, Jet tried to help. He grabbed his weapons, fought alongside the group, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to make it out. Then Long Feng, the head of the Dai Li, appeared. He was calm, controlled, and ruthlessly efficient. He struck Jet down with a single earthbending move, and Jet collapsed, badly injured. The group wanted to save him, wanted to get him out, but Long Feng's forces were overwhelming, and they had to choose. Stay and fight a battle they'd lose, or escape and keep searching for Appa. They escaped. Jet stayed behind, and the last image they had of him was lying on the ground, telling them to go, telling them it was okay. The show never confirmed whether Jet survived or died, but the implication was clear. He wasn't getting out of Lake Laogai. The group left, and Katara carried the guilt of that choice with her. But they also found Appa, deep in the facility, locked in a cell, exhausted and traumatized from weeks of captivity and abuse. The reunion was quiet, emotional, and overwhelming. Aang clung to Appa, and you could see the relief wash over him, the relief of having his friend back, of not losing one more thing. Appa was hurt, scared, and barely able to fly, but he was alive. That was enough. The group got out of the facility and returned to the surface, but the fight with the Dai Li wasn't over. Long Feng knew they'd seen too much, knew they were a threat to the carefully controlled narrative he'd built, and he wasn't going to let them run around the city unchecked. He started moving against them politically, using his influence to isolate them and block their access to the Earth King. Meanwhile, the group had been trying to meet the Earth King for weeks. They had critical information, the eclipse, the invasion plan, the proof that the war was escalating, and they needed the Earth King's support to make it happen. But Long Feng controlled access to the palace, and every request was denied, delayed, or redirected. The system was designed to keep the Earth King isolated, and Long Feng was the gatekeeper. So the group broke in. They snuck into the palace, bypassed the guards, and confronted the Earth King directly. What they found was a young man who genuinely had no idea what was happening in his own kingdom. Long Feng had been feeding him lies for years, telling him the war was distant and manageable, that Ba Sing Se was safe, that everything was fine. The Earth King believed it because he'd never been given a reason not to. He'd been living in a bubble, surrounded by advisors who told him what they wanted him to hear, and he had no idea his city was rotting from the inside. Aang, Katara, Sokka, and Toph told him the truth. They told him about the war, about the Dai Li's brainwashing, about the refugees suffering in the outer ring while the inner ring pretended everything was perfect. They showed him the evidence, and the Earth King's world shattered. He'd been a puppet, and he hadn't even known it. The Earth King confronted Longfeng, and for the first time, the Dai Li's control started to slip. Longfeng tried to spin the situation, tried to maintain his grip, but the Earth King wasn't listening anymore. He arrested Longfeng, dismantled the Dai Li's authority, and promised to support the invasion plan. It was a victory, a real, tangible victory, and the group finally had the backing they needed to move forward. But the cost was clear. Jet was gone. The city's corruption ran deeper than they'd thought. And even with the Earth King's support, Ba Sing Se felt fragile, like the whole structure could collapse if you pushed too hard. The group had exposed the lies, but exposing lies didn't erase the damage they'd caused. During this stretch, the group also followed up on Appa's journey. Through a series of flashbacks, the show revealed what Appa had gone through after being stolen, sold to a circus, abused by the handlers, escaping and wandering lost through the Earth Kingdom, and eventually being captured by Longfeng's agents and dragged to Lake Laogai. It was brutal, and it gave weight to the reunion. Appa hadn't just been missing, he'd been suffering, and the fact that he'd survived it all was a testament to his strength. Toph, meanwhile, had her own encounter with her parents. They'd tracked her to Ba Sing Se, hoping to bring her home, and Toph had to make a choice: go back to the life she'd escaped, or stay with the group and keep fighting. She chose the group, not because she didn't love her parents, but because going back would mean giving up the freedom and purpose she'd found. Her parents didn't understand. They left hurt and angry, convinced Toph had been brainwashed or manipulated. Toph watched them go, and even though she didn't regret her choice, it still hurt. By the end of this chapter, the group had Appa back, the Earth King's support, and a clear path forward for the invasion. But they'd also learned that systems of control like the Dai Li, like Longfeng, like the walls Ba Sing Se had built to keep the war out, were harder to dismantle than they'd thought. The city had fought back, and even though they'd won, the victory felt incomplete. The Eclipse plan was moving forward, but the war was still out there, still grinding forward, and the group was running out of time to prepare for it. The Earth King's support gave the group access to resources they'd never had before: maps, intelligence, military backing. The invasion plan started taking shape. The day of Black Sun, the next solar eclipse, was less than a year away, and the strategy was clear. Strike the Fire Nation capital when firebending was useless, capture Fire Lord Ozai, and end the war in one decisive move. It was bold, risky, and the best shot they had. But before the invasion could happen, Aang needed to finish his training. He'd learned waterbending and was getting better at earthbending, but he still hadn't started firebending, and the thought of it scared him. Fire was the element that had destroyed the Air Nomads, burned Katara's mother, and driven the war for 100 years. Aang didn't want to touch it, didn't want to become the thing he'd spent his whole life running from. He needed time to process that, needed space to figure out how to approach fire without letting it consume him. That space came from an unexpected source: Guru Pathik, an old spiritual teacher who lived at the Eastern Air Temple. Pathik sent Aang a message, saying he could teach Aang to control the Avatar state, to unlock its full power without losing himself in the process. It was exactly what Aang needed: control, clarity, a way to use the Avatar state without fear. So Aang left the group temporarily and flew to the Eastern Air Temple on Appa, leaving Katara, Sokka, and Toph in Ba Sing Se to coordinate the invasion. The training with Guru Pathik was intense, spiritual, and deeply personal. Pathik explained that the Avatar state was blocked by emotional and spiritual locks chakras that needed to be opened by confronting pain, fear, and attachment. Aang worked through them one by one: grief for the Air Nomads, guilt for running away, shame for his failures, and fear of his own power. Each chakra forced Aang to relive his worst moments, and each one left him raw and exhausted. The final chakra was the hardest: letting go of earthly attachment. Pathik told Aang that to unlock the Avatar state fully, he had to release his attachment to Katara, the person he cared about most, the anchor keeping him grounded in the physical world. Aang hesitated. He didn't want to let go of Katara. His feelings for her were real, important, and the idea of cutting that connection felt wrong. But Pathik insisted. Attachment led to suffering, and the Avatar had to rise above personal desires to fulfill his cosmic role. Aang tried. He visualized letting go, felt the Avatar state start to unlock, and then he saw a vision: Katara in danger, crying out for help. The vision shattered his focus, and Aang made a choice. He abandoned the training, flew back to Ba Sing Se on Appa, and chose Katara over cosmic power. Pathik warned him this would have consequences, that walking away now meant he might never fully control the Avatar state, but Aang didn't care. His friends mattered more than ultimate power. Back in Ba Sing Se, things had gone wrong. Azula had infiltrated the city, disguised as a Kyoshi warrior along with Mai and Ty Lee. They'd overpowered the real Kyoshi warriors, stolen their uniforms, and slipped past the city's defenses unnoticed. Once inside, Azula started working quietly, turning the situation to her advantage. She approached Long Feng, who was in prison after being arrested by the Earth King. Azula didn't free him out of kindness, she made him an offer. Help her take control of Ba Sing Se, and she'd give him back his power. Long Feng, desperate and humiliated, agreed. Together, they orchestrated a coup from the shadows, using the Dai Li agents who were still loyal to Long Feng and turning them into Azula's personal force. Katara and Sokka realized something was wrong when the Dai Li started moving against them. They tried to warn the Earth King, tried to stop the coup, but Azula was already 3 steps ahead. She captured the Earth King, imprisoned Sokka and Toph, and forced the city into submission without firing a single public shot. Ba Sing Se's fall wasn't loud or dramatic, it was surgical, efficient, and over before most people realized it had started. Azula also found Zuko. He and Iroh had been living quietly in the upper ring, and Iroh had finally been happy running his tea shop, building a peaceful life. But Azula showed up and offered Zuko the one thing he'd wanted his whole life, a chance to come home with honor. She told him the Avatar was in the city, told him this was his opportunity to capture Aang and reclaim his place in the Fire Nation. All he had to do was side with her. Iroh begged him not to. Iroh told Zuko that going back to the Fire Nation meant becoming someone he wasn't, that Ozai's approval wasn't worth the cost, that Zuko had a chance to choose a different path. But Zuko didn't listen. He was tired of being a fugitive, tired of failing, tired of living in exile. He wanted to go home, and Azula was offering him the way. Meanwhile, Aang arrived in Ba Sing Se and went straight to the crystal catacombs beneath the city, ancient underground caves filled with glowing green crystals, where Azula had lured Katara. Katara had been separated from the group, trapped, and waiting for Azula to finish her. Aang got there first, and for a moment, it looked like they were going to escape. Then Zuko showed up. Zuko stood at the crossroads, literally and figuratively. On one side, Aang and Katara, representing the path Iroh had been trying to guide him toward. On the other side, Azula, representing the Fire Nation, his father's approval, everything he'd been chasing since his exile. Katara tried to reach him. She'd been talking to Zuko before Aang arrived, and she'd seen cracks in his armor, doubt, pain, the possibility that he didn't have to be his father's son. She thought maybe, just maybe, he could choose differently. He didn't. Zuko sided with Azula. He attacked Aang, joined his sister, and turned what could have been a fragile alliance into a betrayal that would define the rest of the war. The fight that followed was chaotic and desperate. Aang and Katara fought together, but Azula and Zuko were too strong, too coordinated. Katara was knocked out, and Aang was cornered. Aang tried to unlock the Avatar state, tried to let go the way Guru Pathak had taught him, and for a second, it worked. His eyes glowed, the power surged, and he started to rise. Then, Azula hit him with lightning. The bolt struck Aang in the back mid-transformation, and the Avatar state shattered. Aang collapsed, lifeless, and Katara barely caught him before he hit the ground. The catacombs filled with Dai Li agents, and Katara knew they were about to die. Then Iroh appeared. He fought off Azula and Zuko, bought Katara enough time to grab Aang's body, and helped her escape to the surface. Iroh stayed behind to cover their retreat, and the last image the group had of him was standing alone against the Fire Nation, knowing he wasn't getting out. Katara got Aang to the surface and found Sokka, Toph, and Appa waiting. They flew out of Ba Sing Se as the city fell completely under Fire Nation control. Aang wasn't breathing. His heart had stopped. Katara used the spirit water she'd been carrying since the North Pole, sacred water meant to heal, and brought him back. Aang's heart started again, but he was unconscious, broken, and the Avatar state was gone. He'd been killed mid-transformation, and no one knew if he'd ever be able to access it again. The group flew away from Ba Sing Se in silence. The city had fallen. The Earth Kingdom's last stronghold was in Fire Nation hands. Iroh was captured. Zuko had betrayed them, and Aang, the Avatar, had been killed and only barely revived. The invasion plan was still intact, but everything else had collapsed. This wasn't a loss, it was a catastrophe, and the group didn't know how to process it yet. The episode ended with the Fire Nation celebrating. Azula returned home as a war hero, Zuko returned home with his honor restored, and Fire Lord Ozai stood victorious, knowing that the Avatar was gone and the Earth Kingdom had been broken. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, it looked like the Fire Nation had already won. The group flew through the night, carrying an unconscious Avatar and the weight of a defeat that felt impossible to recover from. The immediate aftermath of Ba Sing Se's fall was quiet and numb. The group flew on Appa for days, not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do. Aang was unconscious, still recovering from being struck by lightning, and no one knew when or if he'd wake up. Katara stayed by his side constantly, using her healing to try to repair the damage, but the injury was deeper than physical. The Avatar state had been shattered mid-activation, and the spiritual consequences of that were unknown. Sokka tried to keep everyone moving, tried to find a safe place to land and regroup, but everywhere they went felt dangerous. The Fire Nation's reach had expanded, the Earth Kingdom was in chaos, and news of Ba Sing Se's fall was spreading fast. Some towns refused to believe it, others panicked, and a few just gave up, accepting that the war was over and the Fire Nation had won. Toph was angry at Azula, angry at Zuko, angry at the whole situation. She'd spent weeks in Ba Sing Se trying to help, trying to be useful, and it had all collapsed in a single night. She didn't know how to process failure on that scale, so she just stayed quiet and kept her distance from the rest of the group. Eventually, they landed on a small Fire Nation island and stole a Fire Navy ship, using it as a mobile base while they figured out their next move. It was risky traveling on a stolen enemy ship, but it gave them shelter, supplies, and a way to blend in while they regrouped. Sokka took charge of the ship, learning how to navigate, how to maintain it, and how to keep them moving without attracting attention. Aang woke up after several days. He was weak, disoriented, and the first thing he asked was whether they'd stop the Fire Nation. When Katara told him they'd lost, that Ba Sing Se had fallen and the Earth Kingdom was gone, Aang didn't say anything. He just stared at the ceiling, processing the weight of that failure. He'd been killed, actually killed, and even though Katara had brought him back, he didn't feel like the Avatar anymore. The connection to his past lives felt distant, and the Avatar state, the thing that had saved him so many times before, was gone. The group tried to reassure him, tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, but Aang couldn't hear it. He'd failed. The world needed him to be strong, needed him to stop the Fire Nation, and he'd been struck down at the worst possible moment. The guilt was overwhelming, and Aang spent days barely speaking, barely eating, just trying to figure out how to keep going. Katara stayed close. She didn't push him, didn't try to force optimism, but she was there, steady and present, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Slowly, Aang started to come back. He wasn't okay, not even close, but he could function again, could think about the future instead of just drowning in the past. The invasion plan was still on the table. The day of Black Sun was still coming, and the group still had allies who believed in the mission. But the plan had been built on the assumption that the Earth Kingdom would support them, and now the Earth Kingdom was fractured and occupied. They needed to regroup, reconnect with their allies, and figure out how to pull off an invasion with fewer resources and less support than they'd expected. Meanwhile, in the Fire Nation, Zuko was home. He'd restored his honor, reclaimed his place as the Fire Lord's son, and was welcomed back into the palace with ceremony and praise. It should have felt like a victory. It didn't. Zuko kept thinking about Iroh, about the look on his uncle's face when Zuko sided with Azula, about the betrayal he'd committed to get home. Iroh was imprisoned now, locked up for helping the Avatar, and Zuko didn't know how to reconcile that. Azula, on the other hand, was thriving. She'd conquered Ba Sing Se without a major battle, captured the Earth King, and secured the Fire Nation's dominance over the Earth Kingdom. Ozai was impressed, and Azula's status at court rose even higher. But underneath the confidence, cracks were starting to form. Azula's control was built on fear and manipulation, and maintaining that control required constant vigilance. She didn't trust anyone, not even Mai and Ty Lee, and that isolation was starting to wear on her. Mai and Ty Lee, meanwhile, were adjusting to life back in the Fire Nation. They'd followed Azula out of loyalty or fear, but both of them were starting to question what they were doing and why. Mai was bored, detached, and didn't care about the war or Azula's ambitions. Ty Lee was uncomfortable with the cruelty, the manipulation, the way Azula treated people like tools. Neither of them said anything yet, but the seeds of doubt were planted. Back with the group, they started planning for the invasion. They reached out to allies they'd met along the way, the Mechanist who'd helped them before, the Swamp Waterbenders, the Earth Kingdom soldiers who were still willing to fight, and anyone else who hadn't given up yet. The response was mixed. Some people were ready to keep fighting, others had lost hope, and convincing them to risk everything on a single desperate attack wasn't easy. Sokka took the lead on strategy. He'd been planning this invasion for months, thinking through every variable, every risk, every contingency. The Day of Black Sun gave them an 8-minute window when firebending would be completely disabled. 8 minutes to land, fight through the Fire Nation's defenses, reach the Fire Lord, and end the war. It was tight, almost impossible, but it was their best shot. Aang struggled with the idea of confronting Fire Lord Ozai. He still didn't want to kill anyone, still believed there had to be another way. But the closer the invasion got, the harder it became to avoid the question. What do you do when you corner someone who's caused 100 years of suffering? Aang didn't have an answer yet, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. The group also had to address the fact that Aang's connection to the Avatar state was severed. Without it, he was still a powerful bender, but he'd lost the ultimate failsafe that had saved him before. Guru Pathik had warned him this might happen if he walked away from the training, and now Aang was living with the consequences. He didn't regret choosing Katara over cosmic power, but he also knew that losing the Avatar state might cost him when it mattered most. As the invasion date approached, the group trained, planned, and tried to prepare for a battle that would decide everything. The tone was different now. They weren't kids on an adventure anymore. They were soldiers preparing for war, and everyone knew that not all of them were going to make it through the next fight. The losses at Ba Sing Se had taught them that, and the weight of that knowledge sat heavy on all of them. This chapter was about recovery, about figuring out how to keep moving after the worst defeat of the war. The Fire Nation controlled the Earth Kingdom. Aang had been killed and revived, and the group's hope was hanging by a thread. But they still had the invasion. They still had each other, and they still had the belief, fragile as it was, that the war could be stopped. The next act would test that belief in ways they couldn't imagine yet, but for now, they just focused on the next step, surviving long enough to reach the Day of Black Sunday. The stolen Fire Navy ship gave the group access to Fire Nation territory in a way they'd never had before. They could dock at Fire Nation ports, buy supplies, and move through enemy territory without immediately being attacked. But it also meant they had to act the part, dress like Fire Nation citizens, talk like them, and blend in completely. One slip, one moment of carelessness, and they'd be exposed. The group cut their hair, changed their clothes, and practiced their cover stories. Aang hid his arrows under a headband and a wig, Katara pretended to be from a Fire Nation colony, and Sokka leaned into the role harder than anyone, adopting a Fire Nation persona with enthusiasm that bordered on ridiculous. Toph didn't have to change much. Earthbenders weren't visually distinct in the Fire Nation, and her attitude fit right in. Their first real test came when they enrolled Aang in a Fire Nation school. The idea was to gather intelligence, understand how Fire Nation citizens thought, and maybe learn something useful about their defenses. What they found instead was a snapshot of life inside the Empire kids who'd been raised on propaganda, taught that the Fire Nation was bringing peace to the world, and who genuinely believed the war was justified. Aang tried to fit in, but everything about the school felt wrong. The students were disciplined to the point of being robotic. The curriculum glorified Fire Lord Ozai and demonized the other nations, and even the games the kids played were about war and conquest. When Aang introduced a simple dance from the Air Nomads during a school event, the other kids loved it. It was fun, spontaneous, everything their rigid culture wasn't, but the teachers shut it down immediately. Creativity, joy, anything that didn't serve the Fire Nation's goals was discouraged. The experience left Aang conflicted. These were just kids. They hadn't started the war, hadn't chosen this life, and most of them were kind when you got past the propaganda. But they were also being shaped into the next generation of soldiers and supporters, and Aang didn't know how to reconcile that. The Fire Nation wasn't just an army, it was a culture, a system, and fighting it meant confronting more than just firebenders. After the school mission, the group kept moving through Fire Nation territory, hitting small towns and gathering information. One of those stops brought them to a polluted river where a Fire Nation factory had been dumping waste for years, poisoning the water and making the nearby village sick. Katara couldn't ignore it. She put on a disguise, pretended to be a spirit called the Painted Lady, and started helping the villagers, healing the sick, cleaning the water, sabotaging the factory. It was risky. Every time Katara acted as the Painted Lady, she risked exposing the group, and Sokka was furious when he found out. He told her they couldn't afford to help every village they passed, that they had a mission and a timeline, and that stopping to fix the Fire Nation's problems would get them all killed. Katara understood his logic, but she couldn't walk away. These people were suffering right in front of her, and if she didn't help, who would? The argument between Katara and Sokka wasn't about right or wrong, it was about priorities, about what kind of people they wanted to be while fighting a war. Sokka believed in the mission above all else. Katara believed that the mission didn't mean anything if they lost their humanity along the way. Eventually, the group helped Katara finish what she'd started, destroyed the factory, and left the village better than they'd found it. But the tension between immediate compassion and long-term strategy lingered. During this stretch, the group also encountered a small Fire Nation town, where the people weren't cruel or fanatical, they were just tired. They didn't love the war, didn't care about conquest, and mostly just wanted their families to be safe. It was another reminder that the Fire Nation wasn't a monolith, that reducing it to the enemy ignored the complexity of the people living inside it. Aang saw that complexity and held on to it, because if the Fire Nation was full of people like this, people who could be reached, who could change, then maybe ending the war didn't have to mean destroying everyone in it. But the group also saw the other side. They passed through towns where propaganda was absolute, where children were taught to hate the other nations, and where dissent was punished swiftly and publicly. The Fire Nation's control over its own people was just as ruthless as its control over occupied territory, and anyone who questioned the system was silenced. Aang still needed a firebending teacher, and he still didn't know how to approach fire without fear. He'd seen what firebending could do, the destruction, the pain, the way it consumed everything, and he didn't want to become that. But he also knew he couldn't avoid it forever. The invasion was coming, and if he didn't master all 4 elements, he wouldn't be able to face the Fire Lord. The group didn't find a firebending teacher yet, but they were getting closer. They heard rumors of a master who lived in the Fire Nation, someone who understood fire differently, who taught it as more than just destruction. The group filed that information away and kept moving, knowing they'd need it soon. By the end of this chapter, the group had spent weeks living inside Fire Nation territory, seeing the Empire from the inside and understanding it in a way they never had before. The Fire Nation wasn't just an army, it was a nation of people, some complicit, some struggling, some trying to survive. That complexity didn't excuse the war, didn't erase the suffering, but it did make the path forward harder to see. Aang couldn't just defeat the Fire Nation. He had to figure out how to end the war without becoming the thing he was fighting against, and time was running out. The day of Black Sun was getting close, and the group's preparation intensified. Sokka had been coordinating with their allies, Earth Kingdom soldiers, resistance fighters, the mechanists, inventors, and anyone else willing to join the invasion. The plan was ambitious. Use submarines to approach the Fire Nation undetected, land during the eclipse, fight through the capital's defenses, and reach Fire Lord Ozai before firebending returned. 8 minutes. That's all they had. But Sokka wasn't just planning the invasion, he was also dealing with his own insecurities. He'd spent the entire journey surrounded by benders, Aang, Katara, Toph, and now the dozens of benders joining the invasion force. Sokka didn't have bending. He had his boomerang, his sword, and his brain, and sometimes that didn't feel like enough. He wanted to contribute, wanted to be useful in a way that mattered, and he didn't want to be the weak link when the real fight started. That need led him to Master Piandao, a legendary swordsman living in the Fire Nation. Piandao was retired, reclusive, and known for training only the most dedicated students. Sokka showed up asking for lessons, and Piandao agreed to teach him not because Sokka was naturally talented, but because Sokka was determined. The training was grueling. Piandao didn't coddle his students, didn't offer shortcuts, and didn't accept anything less than total commitment. Sokka learned quickly. He trained with practice swords, then moved to real blades, and eventually forged his own sword from a meteorite, a weapon that was uniquely his, something no bender could replicate. The process of making the sword, of shaping metal with his own hands and embedding a piece of space rock into Fire Nation steel, gave Sokka something he'd been missing, proof that he belonged in this fight, that his contributions mattered even without bending. At the end of the training, Piandao revealed that he'd known Sokka was from the Water Tribe the whole time. He'd seen through the disguise immediately, but had chosen to train him anyway, because talent and dedication weren't bound by nation. Piandao also hinted that he didn't agree with the Fire Nation's war, that there were people inside the Empire who wanted things to change, and that Sokka's fight was worth supporting. It was a small moment of hope, a reminder that not everyone in the Fire Nation was an enemy. While Sokka trained with Piandao, Toph had her own arc. She'd been running small scams to make money for the group, using her earthbending and her ability to sense lies to cheat people out of their coins. It was harmless at first, just hustling Fire Nation citizens who wouldn't miss a few pieces, but it escalated when she got caught by a local crime boss. The situation spiraled, and Toph had to fight her way out of a mess she'd created. The experience forced her to confront the fact that she didn't trust people easily, that she'd been using her bending to keep distance between herself and everyone else, and that being part of a team meant letting people in even when it was uncomfortable. Aang, meanwhile, was struggling with the approaching invasion. He'd been training, improving his earthbending and waterbending, but he still didn't have a firebending teacher, and more importantly, he still didn't know what he was going to do when he faced Fire Lord Ozai. Everyone assumed Aang would kill the Fire Lord, end the war by ending the man who started it, but Aang couldn't reconcile that with who he was. The Air Nomads had taught him that all life was sacred, and taking a life, even to stop a tyrant, felt like betraying everything he believed in. He didn't talk about it much. He kept the doubt inside, kept training, kept preparing, but the question haunted him: how do you stop someone like Ozai without becoming like him? Aang didn't have an answer, and the closer the invasion got, the heavier that uncertainty became. The nightmares started around this time. Aang dreamed about the invasion going wrong, about his friends dying, about failing again the way he'd failed at Ba Sing Se. He dreamed about facing Ozai and freezing, about the Avatar state not returning when he needed it, about being too weak to do what everyone expected. The dreams left him exhausted, anxious, and questioning whether he was ready for what was coming. Katara noticed. She tried to reassure him, tried to remind him that he wasn't alone, that the invasion wasn't just on his shoulders, but Aang couldn't shake the feeling that if he failed again, the war would be over and the Fire Nation would win. The pressure was immense, and he didn't know how to carry it without breaking. As the invasion force gathered, the group reconnected with people they'd met along the way. Haru, the earthbender Katara had freed from the Fire Nation prison, showed up with his father. The Mechanist arrived with his inventions, submarines designed to move underwater and avoid detection. The Swamp Waterbenders came, along with other fighters from across the Earth Kingdom. Even Bato, Sokka and Katara's father's friend, joined the effort. Slowly, the scattered resistance coalesced into something resembling an army. But it wasn't a professional military. It was a group of desperate people who'd lost everything to the Fire Nation and were willing to risk one last fight to take it back. The odds weren't good. The Fire Nation's home defenses were formidable, and even with the eclipse, the window of opportunity was impossibly small. But it was the only plan they had, and everyone knew this might be their only chance. Sokka gave a speech before they left, trying to rally the troops, trying to project confidence even though he was terrified. He talked about the eclipse, about the Fire Nation's vulnerability, about the chance to end 100 years of suffering. The speech wasn't perfect. Sokka wasn't a natural orator, but it was honest, and people responded to that. They weren't fighting because they thought they'd win. They were fighting because not fighting meant giving up, and none of them were ready to do that. The group boarded the submarines and headed toward the Fire Nation capital. The trip was tense, quiet, and filled with the kind of anticipation that makes every second feel too long. Aang sat alone, staring at the water, trying to prepare himself for what was coming. Katara sat nearby, not saying anything, just being present. Sokka checked and rechecked the plan, looking for flaws, trying to account for every variable. Toph tried to stay calm, but you could see the nervous energy in the way she tapped her foot against the metal floor. As the submarines approached the Fire Nation coast, the eclipse began. The sky darkened, the moon passed in front of the sun, and firebending across the world went silent. The invasion had 8 minutes to do the impossible. The submarines surfaced, the troops poured out onto the beaches, and the battle for the Fire Nation capital began. This was it. Everything they'd been building toward, every loss they'd survived, every lesson they'd learned, it all came down to the next 8 minutes. The eclipse hit exactly on schedule, and for 8 minutes, the Fire Nation's greatest weapon was gone. No firebending, no flames, just soldiers, defenses, and the raw panic of an empire realizing it was vulnerable for the first time in a century. The invasion force stormed the beaches, moving fast and coordinated, and the initial assault went better than anyone had expected. The Fire Nation's outer defenses crumbled without firebending to support them, and the path to the capital opened up. Aang, Sokka, and Toph led a small strike team toward the Fire Lord's bunker, a hidden underground chamber where Ozai was supposed to be waiting out the eclipse. The rest of the invasion force held the line above, keeping Fire Nation soldiers busy and buying the strike team time. Everything depended on reaching Ozai before the eclipse ended. They fought through the palace grounds, past traps and automated defenses that didn't require bending to operate. The Fire Nation had prepared for this. They'd known an eclipse was coming, and they'd built contingencies, mechanical weapons, deadfalls, gates that could be sealed remotely. It was harder than the group had expected, but they kept pushing forward. Then they hit a wall, literally. A massive metal door blocked the entrance to the bunker, and no amount of earthbending could break through. Toph tried. She slammed rocks against it, tried to sense weak points, but the door was too thick, too well designed. They were stuck, and the clock was ticking. Sokka tried to think. There had to be another way in, some ventilation shaft or service tunnel they could use. But the Fire Nation had built the bunker to be impenetrable, and time was running out. Every second they spent trying to break through was a second closer to the eclipse ending and firebending returning. Then Azula appeared. She wasn't in the bunker. She was on the surface, moving through the palace, and when she found the strike team struggling with the door, she smiled. She didn't attack, she didn't need to. She just started talking, calm and smug, and told them the truth. The Fire Lord wasn't in the bunker. He'd known about the invasion, known about the eclipse, and he'd left. The bunker was empty. The whole plan had been anticipated, and they'd been fighting toward nothing. Aang didn't believe her at first. This had to be a trick, a stalling tactic to waste their time. But Azula's confidence was too real, too specific. She wasn't bluffing. The Fire Nation had known they were coming, and Ozai had simply left. The invasion had been a trap, not a physical trap, but a strategic one. Let them land, let them exhaust their forces, and then crush them when firebending returned. The realization hit like a punch. All the planning, all the coordination, all the hope, it had been built on the assumption that Ozai would be in the bunker, and he wasn't. The mission had failed before it even started. Sokka's plan had been perfect, except for the one variable he couldn't account for, the Fire Nation knowing they were coming. The eclipse ended. The moon moved past the sun, light returned, and firebending came back in a wave of heat and flame. The Fire Nation soldiers, who'd been fighting defensively for 8 minutes, suddenly had their power back, and the tide turned instantly. The invasion force, which had been winning, was now surrounded and outgunned. Azula attacked. Her blue fire cut through the strike team's defenses, and the fight that followed was desperate and chaotic. Aang tried to hold her off, tried to give Sokka and Toph time to retreat, but Azula was too strong, too fast, and too prepared. She'd been waiting for this moment, and she was enjoying it. Sokka made the call. Retreat. They couldn't win. The mission had failed, and staying meant dying for nothing. The group pulled back, fought their way to the submarines, and tried to evacuate as many people as they could. But the Fire Nation was closing in, and not everyone made it out. The younger members of the invasion force, Aang, Katara, Sokka, Toph, and the other kids were ordered to leave first. The adults stayed behind to cover the retreat, knowing they'd be captured or killed. Hakoda, Sokka, and Katara's father was one of them. He told his kids to go, told them the fight wasn't over, and stayed behind with the others while the submarines pulled away. The group escaped, but barely. They watched from the water as the Fire Nation rounded up the remaining invaders, as their fathers, their allies, and their friends were captured and dragged away. The invasion had been their best shot at ending the war, and it had failed completely. Worse, it had cost them people they couldn't replace. On the submarine, the mood was devastated. Sokka blamed himself. His plan had failed, his intelligence had been wrong, and people had died because of it. Aang blamed himself too. He was the Avatar, and he'd failed again. Katara tried to hold the group together, but even she was struggling. Toph didn't say much. She just sat in the corner, processing the loss in her own way. As the submarine moved away from the Fire Nation coast, Aang made a decision. He couldn't keep failing. He couldn't keep letting people down. He needed a firebending teacher, and he needed to figure out how to face Ozai, because the next time they met, there wouldn't be an eclipse to help. The war wasn't over, but it felt like they were losing, and Aang didn't know how to turn that around. Then something unexpected happened. A small Fire Nation balloon approached the submarine, and when it landed, Zuko stepped out. He was alone, unarmed, and he looked different. Tired, uncertain, but determined. He told the group he wanted to join them, wanted to teach Aang firebending, and wanted to help them stop his father. No one believed him. Katara especially. She remembered the catacombs, remembered Zuko siding with Azula, remembered Aang being struck down because Zuko had chosen wrong. She didn't trust him, didn't want him anywhere near the group, and made it very clear that if he tried anything, she'd end him. But Zuko didn't leave. He stayed nearby, camping on the beach while the group debated what to do. He'd spent weeks after Ba Sing Se trying to be the person the Fire Nation wanted him to be, trying to fit back into his old life, and it hadn't worked. He'd gotten everything he thought he wanted, his father's approval, his place in the palace, his honor restored, and it felt empty. Iroh's absence haunted him, and the more he thought about his uncle's disappointment, the more he realized he'd made the wrong choice. Zuko had confronted his father, renounced the Fire Nation, and left. He'd chosen the Avatar's side, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And now he was here, waiting for the group to believe him, knowing they had every reason not to. The Day of Black Sun had been a disaster. The invasion had failed, their allies were captured, and the group was back to running with no clear path forward. But Zuko's arrival introduced a new possibility, one the group wasn't ready to accept yet, but one that might matter more than they realized. The war had just gotten harder, and the group was smaller and more vulnerable than they'd ever been. But they were still moving, still fighting, and still refusing to give up. The Western Air Temple hung upside down from a cliff, built into the rock in a way that defied logic and gravity. It was abandoned, isolated, and one of the few places the Fire Nation hadn't bothered to occupy. The group landed there to rest, regroup, and figure out what to do next. The invasion had failed, their allies were captured, and the path forward was murky at best. They needed time to heal, to plan, and to process the weight of everything they'd lost. Zuko followed them. He didn't force his way in, he just camped nearby, within sight of the temple, and waited. Every day, he tried to approach the group, tried to explain why he wanted to help, and every day, they turned him away. Aang was cautious, Sokka was skeptical, Toph was curious but non-committal, and Katara was furious. She didn't just distrust Zuko, she hated him, and she made sure he knew it. Zuko tried different approaches. He offered to teach Aang firebending. He explained that he'd left the Fire Nation, renounced his father, and was trying to do the right thing. He even brought gifts, food, supplies, things the group needed. Nothing worked. The group had been betrayed too many times, and Zuko's history made it impossible to take him at his word. Then Combustion Man showed up. A Fire Nation assassin Zuko had hired weeks earlier, back when he was still hunting the Avatar. Combustion Man was a specialist, a firebender who could create explosions with his mind, attacking from long range with devastating precision. Zuko had forgotten about him, or assumed the contract had expired. But Combustion Man was still on the job, and he attacked the group at the Western Air Temple. The fight was brutal. Combustion Man's attacks were explosive, unpredictable, and nearly impossible to defend against. The group scattered, tried to fight back, but they were outmatched. Zuko, realizing the danger he'd brought down on them, joined the fight. He attacked Combustion Man, tried to call him off, tried to explain that the contract was void. Combustion Man didn't care. He turned on Zuko, and the battle escalated. Eventually, the group managed to disrupt Combustion Man's attack. Sokka hit him with his boomerang at the exact moment he was focusing his power, causing the explosion to backfire. Combustion Man fell from the cliff, and the threat was over. The group was shaken, but alive, and Zuko had just saved them from a problem he'd created. It wasn't enough to earn their trust, not completely, but it was a start. Toph was the first to soften. She'd been using her earthbending to sense Zuko's heartbeat, listening for lies, and she believed he was being honest. She told the group she thought they should give him a chance, that people could change, and that they needed a firebending teacher whether they liked Zuko or not. Aang agreed, reluctantly. He didn't fully trust Zuko, but he needed to learn firebending, and Zuko was the only option available. Sokka went along with it, though he made it clear he'd be watching Zuko closely. Katara refused. She told Aang that bringing Zuko into the group was a mistake, that he'd betray them again, and that she wanted nothing to do with him. But she didn't leave. She stayed with the group, kept her distance from Zuko, and made it clear she'd be ready to strike if he stepped out of line. Zuko joined the group, officially, and the dynamic shifted. He wasn't welcomed, he was tolerated, barely, and every interaction was tense. But he was there, and he was trying, and that mattered. The first firebending lesson was a disaster. Zuko tried to teach Aang the traditional Fire Nation way aggressive, forceful, drawing power from anger and domination. But Aang couldn't connect with that. His whole personality was built on peace, on avoiding conflict, and trying to bend fire through rage felt wrong. The lesson ended with Aang accidentally burning Katara just a small burn on her hands, but enough to terrify him and reinforce every fear he had about firebending. Aang refused to continue. He didn't want to touch fire again, didn't want to risk hurting someone he cared about, and he told Zuko the lessons were over. Zuko, frustrated and desperate to prove himself, realized the problem. He'd been teaching firebending the way the Fire Nation taught it, but that wasn't the only way. Fire wasn't just destruction, it was life, energy, warmth. The Fire Nation had corrupted firebending into a weapon, but the original source, the true meaning of fire, was something else. Zuko took Aang to see the original firebenders, the dragons. Most people thought dragons were extinct, hunted to death by Fire Nation soldiers proving their strength. But Zuko knew of 2 dragons that had survived, hidden away and protected by an ancient order called the Sun Warriors. The Sun Warriors were the original firebending civilization, the people who'd learned bending directly from the dragons before the Fire Nation twisted it into conquest. Aang and Zuko traveled to the Sun Warrior ruins, performed the ancient ritual, and met the dragons, Ran and Shaw. The dragons tested them, surrounded them with fire and a display of raw, overwhelming power, and then shared the truth of firebending. Fire wasn't about anger or destruction. It was about energy, life, and passion. It could create as easily as it could destroy, and understanding that balance was the key to mastering it. The experience changed both of them. Aang finally understood fire in a way that didn't scare him, and Zuko realized how much the Fire Nation had lost by turning firebending into a tool of war. They returned to the Western Air Temple, and the lessons resumed. This time, they worked. Aang learned to bend fire without fear, and Zuko proved he could teach without falling back on anger and aggression. The group's dynamic started to settle. Zuko was still the outsider, still not fully trusted, but he was contributing. He helped with plans, shared intelligence about the Fire Nation's defenses, and slowly started to feel like part of the team. Katara, though, remained distant. She didn't forgive him, didn't trust him, and every interaction between them was cold and sharp. One night, Zuko tried to talk to her, tried to explain why he'd made the choices he had and why he was trying to change. Katara didn't want to hear it. She told him about her mother, how the Fire Nation had killed her, how that loss had shaped her entire life, and how seeing Zuko, a Fire Nation prince, pretend to care felt like an insult. Zuko listened, didn't defend himself, and just accepted her anger. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the beginning of understanding. During this time, the group also learned about Sozin's Comet. The same comet that had empowered the Fire Nation 100 years ago was returning at the end of summer. And when it arrived, firebenders would be unstoppable. Fire Lord Ozai planned to use the comet's power to burn the entire Earth Kingdom to the ground, wiping out any remaining resistance and securing the Fire Nation's dominance forever. The timeline had just gotten brutally short. The comet was coming, and if they didn't stop Ozai before it arrived, the war would be over and the Fire Nation would win. The group had weeks, maybe a month at most, to prepare for the biggest fight of their lives. Aang needed to master firebending, the group needed a plan to reach Ozai, and they needed to figure out how to stop a Fire Lord empowered by a comet that made firebending exponentially stronger. The weight of that challenge sat heavy on everyone, but they didn't have time to despair. They just had to keep training, keep planning, and hope they'd be ready when the moment came. By the end of this chapter, Zuko had earned a tentative place in the group, Aang had learned firebending from the original source, and the final deadline had been set. Sozin's Comet was coming, and the war would end one way or another when it arrived. The group wasn't ready yet, but ready or not, the fight was almost here. The group knew they couldn't face Ozai without help, and some of their best allies were locked up in Fire Nation prisons. Sokka's father, Hakoda, was one of them, captured during the Day of Black Sun invasion and held in the Boiling Rock, the Fire Nation's most secure prison. Sokka couldn't leave his father there. He didn't care how impossible the rescue was. He was going to get him out, and Zuko volunteered to help. The two of them flew to the Boiling Rock on Zuko's war balloon, leaving the rest of the group behind to continue training. The prison was brutal, built inside a volcano, surrounded by boiling water, and designed to be inescapable. Guards were everywhere, security was tight, and one wrong move would get them both killed. But Sokka had a plan, and Zuko had insider knowledge of how Fire Nation prisons operated. They infiltrated the prison by pretending to be guards, blending in with the staff and searching for Hakoda. What they found instead was Suki, the leader of the Kyoshi warriors, who'd been captured during Azula's takeover of Ba Sing Se. Sokka hadn't seen her since Kyoshi Island, and the reunion was emotional, complicated, and layered with everything they'd both been through since then. Suki joined the escape plan immediately, but they still needed to find Hakoda. When they finally located him, the plan had already started to fall apart. The warden suspected something was wrong, security had tightened, and the window for escape was closing. Worse, Azula showed up. She'd been tracking Zuko, suspecting he'd betray the Fire Nation, and she'd followed him to the Boiling Rock to confirm it. The confrontation between Azula and Zuko was tense, personal, and cut to the core of their family's dysfunction. Azula mocked him, told him he'd always been weak, and made it clear she didn't care about him, only about her own status and power. But something unexpected happened. Mai, Azula's supposed best friend, turned on her. Mai had been watching Azula manipulate, control, and hurt people for years, and she'd had enough. When Azula tried to stop Sokka and the others from escaping, Mai intervened, blocking Azula's attacks and giving the group time to get away. Azula was stunned. She couldn't understand why Mai would betray her, and Mai's answer was simple. "I love Zuko more than I fear you." Azula turned on Mai, ready to kill her, but Ty Lee stepped in. She chi-blocked Azula, paralyzing her and stopping the attack. It was the ultimate betrayal. Ty Lee, the loyal acrobat who'd followed Azula everywhere, had chosen Mai over her. Azula was left powerless, humiliated, and abandoned, while the Boiling Rock guards arrested Mai and Ty Lee for treason. The escape succeeded. Sokka, Zuko, Suki, and Hakoda made it out on a stolen airship, fought off Fire Nation pursuers, and flew back to the Western Air Temple. The mission had worked, but it had cost Azula something irreplaceable: her control. Her friends had turned on her, her brother had rejected her, and for the first time, Azula's carefully maintained image of perfection started to crack. Back at the temple, the group reunited with Hakoda and Suki, and the dynamic shifted again. Sokka had his father back, Suki was safe, and the group finally felt like they had the numbers and experience to take on the Fire Nation. But there was still work to do. Aang's firebending was improving, but he wasn't a master yet, and the comet was getting closer every day. Around this time, Zuko approached Aang with a suggestion. They should break into the Fire Nation's highest security prison and free Iroh. Zuko's uncle had been captured after helping Aang and Katara escape Ba Sing Se, and Zuko felt responsible for his imprisonment. More than that, Zuko believed Iroh could help them not just as a powerful firebender, but as a wise strategist who understood the Fire Nation better than anyone. The group agreed, and they launched a prison break targeting Iroh's location. But when they got there, Iroh was already gone. He'd escaped on his own during a prison riot, disappearing into the chaos and leaving no trace. The group didn't know where he was, but Zuko took it as a sign. Iroh was out there, somewhere, and when the time came, he'd show up. Zuko just had to trust that. Meanwhile, tensions within the Fire Nation continued to escalate. Azula's breakdown accelerated after the Boiling Rock. She'd lost Mai and Ty Lee, the only people she'd considered friends, and the betrayal ate at her. She started seeing threats everywhere, firing servants for imagined disloyalty, and isolating herself further. Fire Lord Ozai noticed, but he didn't care about Azula's mental state. He only cared about results, and as long as she was useful, he left her alone. Ozai's plan for the comet became clearer. He was going to name himself the Phoenix King, ruling over a global empire, and he was going to leave Azula behind to govern the Fire Nation while he burned the Earth Kingdom to ash. It was a position of power, technically, but it was also a way of sidelining Azula, keeping her out of the real action. Azula realized she was being dismissed, and the combination of losing her friends, losing her father's full confidence, and losing control over her own mind pushed her closer to breaking. Back with the group, Katara finally confronted Zuko about her mother. She'd been holding on to her anger, her grief, and her hatred of the Fire Nation, and she needed to know if Zuko was willing to help her find the man who'd killed her mother. Zuko agreed, and the two of them traveled together on a mission of revenge. They tracked down the soldier responsible, a retired Fire Nation officer who'd led the raid on Katara's village years ago. When they found him, Katara had the chance to take revenge, to make him pay for what he'd done, and for a moment, it looked like she was going to kill him, but she didn't. She looked at him old, pathetic, scared, and realized that killing him wouldn't bring her mother back. It wouldn't fix anything. It would just make her into someone she didn't want to be. Katara spared him, not because he deserved it, but because she refused to let her grief turn her into a killer. She left him alive, and she and Zuko returned to the group. On the way back, Katara told Zuko she forgave him not for his sake, but for hers. She was done carrying the weight of her hatred, and forgiving Zuko was part of letting that go. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was closure, and it meant Zuko was finally, truly part of the team. By the end of this chapter, the group had grown stronger. They'd freed their allies, confronted their pasts, and started to heal the wounds that had been festering since the beginning of the journey. Azula, meanwhile, was falling apart, losing the control that had defined her entire life. The comet was days away, and the final battle was approaching fast. The group wasn't perfect, wasn't invincible, but they were together, and that was going to have to be enough. The comet was 3 days away, and the group gathered at Ember Island, a Fire Nation beach town where the royal family used to vacation. It was a strange choice for a hideout, but that's exactly why it worked. No one expected the Avatar to be hiding in plain sight at a Fire Nation resort, and the group needed a few days to finalize their plan and prepare mentally for what was coming. On the first night, they found a theater putting on a play called The Ember Island Players, and out of curiosity, they went to see it. The play was a Fire Nation propaganda piece that retold the Avatar's journey from the Fire Nation's perspective, and it was bad. The actors were over the top, the characterizations were cartoonish, and the events were wildly distorted. Aang was played by a woman, Katara was weepy and obsessed with hope, Sokka was reduced to comic relief, and Toph was a huge muscular man. Zuko's character was the only one portrayed somewhat accurately, which annoyed him more than it should have. The group laughed at first, but as the play went on, it stopped being funny. The play forced them to watch their own failures, their own losses, replayed for entertainment. It showed Zuko betraying them at Ba Sing Se, showed Aang dying, showed Katara crying over his body. By the end, the group was sitting in uncomfortable silence, processing the weight of everything they'd been through. The play ended with the Fire Nation winning, with Ozai standing victorious and the Avatar defeated, and the audience cheered. It was a jarring reminder of how the Fire Nation saw them not as heroes, but as enemies, obstacles to be crushed. And it forced the group to confront the possibility that maybe, despite everything, they weren't going to win. The play had been propaganda, but the fear it stirred up was real. After the play, Aang's anxiety spiraled. He'd been avoiding the central question of the war, what to do about Ozai, but time had run out. Everyone assumed he'd kill the Fire Lord. That was the plan, the expectation, the only way to end the war decisively. But Aang couldn't do it. He was an airbender, raised in a culture that valued all life, and taking a life even Ozai's felt like betraying everything the Air Nomads had taught him. He tried to talk to his friends about it, tried to explain his dilemma, but no one had a good answer. Sokka told him sometimes you had to make hard choices to protect the people you loved. Katara said she understood his struggle but didn't know how to help. Zuko said that Ozai was too dangerous to leave alive, that mercy would only lead to more suffering. Even Aang's past lives, when he meditated and tried to seek their guidance, told him the same thing. Every avatar before him had been willing to kill when necessary, and this was one of those times. Aang didn't accept that answer. He refused to believe that 100 generations of avatars being willing to kill meant he had to as well. There had to be another way, some solution he hadn't thought of yet, some path that didn't require him to compromise his values. But he didn't know what it was, and the comet was almost here. The night before the final battle, Aang disappeared. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think, and he wandered off into the ocean, trying to clear his head. When he woke up, he was on a mysterious island that hadn't been there before, an island that moved, that felt alive, and that seemed to exist outside normal geography. The island was actually a lion turtle, an ancient creature from before the era of the Avatar, and it had a message for Aang. The lion turtle told Aang about energy bending, a form of bending that predated the four elements, a power that could change a person's very essence. It was dangerous if the bender's spirit wasn't strong enough, they'd be corrupted instead of their target, but it offered a way to stop Ozai without killing him. The lion turtle didn't explain how it worked, didn't give Aang a step-by-step guide, but it planted the idea and sent Aang back to his friends with a glimmer of hope. When Aang returned, the group was frantic. They'd been searching for him, terrified he'd been captured or killed, and his sudden disappearance had thrown the entire plan into chaos. Aang apologized, explained where he'd been, sort of, and told them he had a new option for dealing with Ozai. He didn't explain what energy bending was, partly because he didn't fully understand it himself, but he told the group he was going to try something different. The group didn't push him. They trusted Aang, even when they didn't fully understand his choices, and they knew he'd been struggling with this for weeks. If he'd found a solution, they were willing to let him try. The final plan came together. The group would split up. Aang would confront Fire Lord Ozai during the comet, using Ozai's arrogance and his belief in his own invincibility to get close. Meanwhile, Sokka, Toph, and Suki would sabotage the Fire Nation's airship fleet, the armada Ozai planned to use to burn the Earth Kingdom. Zuko and Katara would go to the Fire Nation capital to stop Azula, who'd been crowned Fire Lord in Ozai's absence, and was spiraling into full breakdown. Everyone knew this was the last mission. There was no backup plan, no second chance. If they failed, the Fire Nation would win, and the world would burn. The group said their goodbyes, not in a dramatic way, but in quiet acknowledgments that this might be the last time they saw each other. Then they split up and headed toward their separate battles. The comet appeared in the sky, a streak of fire that lit up the night and amplified firebending across the world. The Fire Nation's power surged, and the final battle for the fate of the world began. This chapter was about confronting the last questions, the ones that didn't have easy answers. It was about Aang choosing to believe in a solution that no one else could see, about the group trusting each other enough to fight separate battles, and about stepping into the unknown with the hope that it would be enough. The comet was here, the war was ending, and everything they'd fought for came down to the next few hours. The comet burned across the sky, and the Fire Nation's power exploded. Firebending that had been strong before became overwhelming, unstoppable, capable of leveling cities and turning battlefields into ash. Fire Lord Ozai stood on his airship, leading the fleet toward the Earth Kingdom, ready to incinerate everything in his path. This was the Fire Nation's endgame, and Ozai believed he'd already won. Aang found him. He intercepted Ozai's airship, confronted him mid-flight, and the fight began. Ozai was faster, stronger, and more ruthless than any firebender Aang had faced before. The comet amplified his power to terrifying levels, and every attack felt like it could end the fight in seconds. Aang fought defensively, dodging, evading, trying to find an opening, but Ozai was relentless. He mocked Aang, called him weak, told him the Avatar was finished, and the Fire Nation's victory was inevitable. Aang tried to fight back, tried to use all four elements to match Ozai's firebending, but it wasn't enough. Ozai's attacks were too strong, and Aang was losing ground. The fight moved across the landscape over forests, through canyons, across rocky pillars, and everywhere they went, Ozai left destruction. He burned the land just to prove he could, just to show Aang how powerless he was to stop it. At one point, Ozai hit Aang with a blast of fire that knocked him into a rock formation, and the impact triggered something. Aang's scar, the wound from Azula's lightning back in Ba Sing Se, was struck, and the energy blockage that had cut him off from the Avatar state broke. The glow returned. Aang rose into the air, eyes and tattoos blazing, and the Avatar state activated fully for the first time since the catacombs. The fight flipped instantly. Aang, channeling the power of all his past lives, overwhelmed Ozai. He bent all four elements simultaneously, stripped away Ozai's defenses, and pinned him to the ground. The Fire Lord was helpless, defeated, and Aang stood over him with a spear of rock aimed at his heart. All he had to do was strike, and the war would be over. But Aang didn't. Even in the Avatar state, even with the combined will of 100 lifetimes pushing him to end Ozai, Aang refused to kill. He pulled back, let the Avatar state fade, and chose a different path. He placed his hands on Ozai's forehead and chest, and he used energy bending, the technique the lion turtle had shown him. The process was brutal, dangerous, and nearly broke Aang's spirit. Ozai's energy fought back, tried to corrupt him, but Aang's resolve held. He didn't just defeat Ozai, he took away his firebending, stripping him of the power that had made him dangerous and leaving him as just a man. The Fire Lord collapsed, powerless and humiliated. The war was over, and Ozai had been stopped without bloodshed. Aang had found the third option, the one no one else believed existed, and he'd proven that ending the war didn't require him to become a killer. Meanwhile, Sokka, Toph, and Suki fought across the airship fleet, sabotaging engines and crashing ships before they could reach the Earth Kingdom. The battle was chaotic, filled with close calls and desperate maneuvers. But they succeeded. The fleet was destroyed, and the Earth Kingdom was saved from the fire that had been meant to consume it. At the Fire Nation capital, Zuko and Katara faced Azula. She'd been crowned Fire Lord, but the ceremony had been empty, hollow, because she'd fired everyone who might have attended. She was alone, paranoid, and barely holding herself together. When Zuko and Katara arrived, Azula challenged Zuko to an Agni Kai, a traditional firebending duel for the throne. Zuko accepted, but he knew something was wrong. Azula's attacks were wild, uncontrolled, fueled by rage and desperation rather than precision. The comet made her powerful, but it also amplified her instability, and Zuko realized he might actually win. The duel was brutal, with blue and orange fire tearing across the palace courtyard, but Zuko held his ground. Then Azula broke the rules. She saw she was losing, saw Katara standing nearby, and fired lightning at her instead of Zuko. Zuko didn't hesitate. He threw himself in front of the blast, redirecting the lightning the way Iroh had taught him, but he couldn't fully control it. The lightning struck him, and he collapsed, badly injured. Katara stepped in. She fought Azula one-on-one, using waterbending enhanced by the full moon that had just risen, and the fight was fast, brutal, and decisive. Katara used her environment, water, ice, chains, and outmaneuvered Azula at every turn. She froze Azula to the ground, chained her, and ended the fight without killing her. Azula broke completely. She screamed, cried, and thrashed against the chains. No longer the composed, calculating princess she'd been. She was just broken. Zuko survived his injury, and the throne passed to him. The Fire Nation's war machine ground to a halt, and the new Fire Lord's first act was to call for peace. In Ba Sing Se, the Earth Kingdom was liberated. The White Lotus, a secret society of masters from all nations, including Iroh, who'd escaped prison and gathered allies, retook the city from Fire Nation control. The Earth King returned, the Dai Li were dismantled, and the city that had fallen in darkness was reclaimed in the name of balance and freedom. The war ended not with a single battle, but with a series of victories across the world. Ozai was defeated, the airship fleet was destroyed, Azula was stopped, Ba Sing Se was freed, and the Fire Nation, under Zuko's leadership, began the long, difficult process of making amends for 100 years of conquest. The group reunited in Ba Sing Se for Zuko's coronation as Fire Lord. It was a quiet ceremony, without the pomp and grandeur of previous Fire Nation events, because Zuko didn't want to celebrate the same way his ancestors had. He wanted to lead differently, to build a Fire Nation that stood for peace instead of domination, and he knew it was going to take generations to undo the damage his family had caused. After the coronation, the group gathered one last time at a small tea shop in Ba Sing Se Iroh's tea shop, where he'd finally settled after the war. They sat together, drank tea, and talked about what came next. Aang and Katara held hands, a quiet acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing for years. Sokka joked with Suki. Toph teased Zuko about being Fire Lord, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt still. The war was over, not because one side had destroyed the other, but because people had chosen peace, had chosen to fight for balance instead of dominance, and had refused to let the cycle of violence continue. The Fire Nation would spend years rebuilding trust, the Earth Kingdom would heal slowly, and the world would never be the same as it was before the war. But it would be better, different, scarred, but better. Aang stood with his friends, looking out over Ba Sing Se, and for the first time since he'd woken up in that iceberg, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was still the Avatar, still responsible for balance, but he wasn't alone anymore. He had his friends, his family, and a world that was finally starting to heal. The last shot of the series was simple. Aang and Katara kissing on the balcony, the sun setting behind them, and the world at peace. The war that had burned for 100 years was over, and the Avatar's journey from a scared kid in an iceberg to the person who ended the war without losing himself was complete. The group had started as strangers running from the Fire Nation, and they'd ended as the people who saved the world. Not through power alone, but through trust, compassion, and the refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. The story closed quietly, gently, and with the promise that even after the hardest battles, peace was possible.